The bell above the diner door jingled, breaking the quiet hum of clinking plates and murmured conversations. I glanced up from the counter, a coffee pot in hand, and froze. The man who stepped inside wasn't local. I could tell by the way he moved, like he didn't want to be seen but couldn't afford not to be. His clothes were torn, streaked with something dark, and his eyes locked onto mine as though he already knew me. "Tessa," he said, low but urgent, like it wasn't a guess, like he was sure. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, the lights flickered, a hum vibrating through the air that wasn't from the diner's old power lines. Outside, the wind picked up, and shadows stretched long and unnatural across the parking lot. Then came the knock, a slow, deliberate pounding on the window. I turned, and there they were. Their faces were hollowed, their eyes like dark voids, and they pressed against the glass as though they could slip through it. The man grabbed my arm. "The box. Where is it? What box?" I managed, my voice barely a whisper. His grip tightened. "The one your family left you. If they get it, everything ends." Chapter 1, The Stranger at 314. The diner was quiet except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional sizzle from the grill. Outside, rain pelted the windows, and the small bell above the door hadn't rung in hours. Tessa had grown used to this, the silence, the stillness of a Midwest night that seemed to stretch on forever. Willow Creek wasn't the kind of town that stayed awake after midnight, and even the regulars had long since gone home. She wiped the counter for the third time in 20 minutes, more out of habit than necessity. The radio in the corner buzzed faintly with a static-filled rendition of an old country song, the sound comforting in its familiarity. The bell finally jingled, sharp and sudden, startling her. She looked up. The man who stepped in was a shadow against the rain, tall and angular, his shoulders tense under a black jacket soaked through with water. His boots squeaked faintly against the tile as he crossed the room, and Tessa couldn't help but stare. It wasn't just his height or the way his damp hair clung to his forehead. It was something in the way he carried himself, a mix of purpose and unease, like he was moving through a storm that hadn't quite ended outside. When he looked up, his eyes a green so vivid they seemed to cut through the dim light locked onto hers. Tessa felt a jolt, though she couldn't explain why. "Coffee," he said, his voice low and quiet. "Sure," she replied, shaking herself and reaching for a clean mug. Cream or sugar?" "Black," he said simply. He slid into the farthest booth, his back to the wall, his gaze flickering to the door like he was expecting someone or something. Tessa hesitated, then walked over with the coffee. "Here you go," she said, setting the cup in front of him. His thanks was a barely audible grunt. She would have left it at that, but as she straightened, her eyes caught on something. The cuff of his sleeve had shifted, revealing a swirling black mark on his forearm. It wasn't like any tattoo she'd ever seen, intricate, almost alive in its design, like smoke frozen mid-movement. For a split second, she could have sworn it glowed. "Nice ink," she said before she could stop herself. The man's head snapped up. His gaze pinned her in place, sharp and probing. "It's not," he stopped abruptly, pulling his sleeve down. "Just a tattoo." "Sure," Tessa replied, a little unnerved by his intensity. She opened her mouth to ask more, but before she could, a shadow passed outside the rain-slicked window. It was too quick for her to make out any details. But it was big, much bigger than any animal she'd ever seen. The stranger saw it too. He tensed, his fingers curling around the mug, and when he looked back at her, there was no mistaking the urgency in his expression. "Do you have a back door?" he asked, his voice low and commanding. Tessa blinked. "What? Why?" "Because they're coming." The way he said it made her stomach drop, though she had no idea what he meant. Before she could ask, he stood, his jacket shifting to reveal the hilt of a blade strapped to his side. It wasn't like any knife she'd ever seen. The metal shimmered faintly, almost like it was catching moonlight that didn't exist inside the diner. "What the hell is going on?" Tessa demanded, her voice louder than she intended. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped past her, moving toward the door. The front door rattled. Tessa froze. The windows fogged over as if the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in an instant, and a low, guttural snarl filled the air. She took an instinctive step back. What was that? The stranger turned, his blade now in his hand, the metal gleaming brighter than before. "Stay behind me," he said. "Are you kidding?" Another snarl echoed, this one louder. The windows shook, and something scraped against the door, a heavy, deliberate sound that sent every nerve in Tessa's body screaming. The stranger glanced at her, his expression grim but steady. "If you want to live, do exactly as I say." Tessa didn't argue. She was still gripping the coffee pot like it might actually help her, but her feet carried her closer to him as the door rattled harder. Then, with a sound like splitting wood, the door gave way. The first thing Tessa saw was the claws long and black, curving like scythes. The creature stepped into the diner, its form monstrous and hunched, its eyes burning like coals. Its breath came in heavy, guttural huffs, filling the air with a rank, metallic scent. The stranger moved fast, faster than Tessa thought humanly possible. He lunged, the blade slashing through the air with a bright, unnatural arc. The creature snarled and reared back, but not before the blade connected, drawing a spray of dark, viscous blood. "Get to the back," he shouted over his shoulder. Tessa hesitated, her instincts warring with the sheer unreality of what she was seeing. But as the creature turned its fiery gaze on her, the decision was made for her. She bolted, the coffee pot slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. She didn't stop until she was in the stockroom, her back pressed against the cold metal shelves. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. What the hell was that thing? And who the hell was he? The sounds of the fight echoed through the diner's snarls, shouts, the clang of metal against claws. Then silence. The door creaked open. Tessa's breath caught as the stranger appeared, blood spattered across his jacket, his face pale but resolute. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "They'll be back," he said grimly. Tessa stared at him, her chest heaving. "What was that?" He met her gaze, his green eyes unreadable. "Something you're not ready to believe." "Well, you better try me," she snapped, surprising herself with the force of her own voice. He hesitated, then rolled up his sleeve, revealing the swirling mark again. It seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. "They're called the Hollow Ones," he said. "And if they're here, it means you're in more danger than you can imagine." Chapter 2, Shadows in the Rain. Tessa didn't know how to process what had just happened. Her knees felt weak as she leaned against the cold metal shelves in the stockroom. The stranger stood a few feet away, his shoulders tense as he peered out the small window in the back door. Rain streaked the glass, but it did little to obscure the darkness outside. "The Hollow Ones," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to sound steady. "What the hell are they?" He glanced over his shoulder, his piercing green eyes assessing her. He didn't answer right away, his jaw tight as though weighing how much he should say. "They're not human," he finally said, his tone clipped. "Yeah, no kidding." She snapped, frustration bubbling to the surface. "I figured that out when one busted through the door of my diner looking like it came straight out of a nightmare. Try again." The corner of his mouth twitched, though it wasn't quite a smile. "You're handling this better than I expected." She glared at him. "Trust me, I'm 2 seconds away from losing my mind, but let's focus on the basics. What are they, and why did one of them show up here?" He hesitated, then sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. "The Hollow Ones are remnants. Pieces of something that used to exist but doesn't anymore. They're not alive in the way you understand it, and they're not dead either. They're voids, empty, hungry, dangerous." Tessa stared at him, the words barely making sense. "And they just what?" "Wander around looking for people to eat." "Not people," he said quietly, his gaze flicking toward the window again. "They're looking for power. Something to fill the emptiness inside them." Her breath caught. What kind of power? The silence that followed was heavier than the rain outside. "I don't know yet," he said, though the way he avoided her gaze made her doubt him. "You're lying," she said flatly. His jaw tightened. What matters is that they're drawn to you now. You need to get out of here before more show up. Tessa blinked, her heart skipping a beat. Wait, hold on, they're after me. Yes, why? Because of something in your blood. That made her laugh short, sharp, and completely humorless. Okay, now you've lost me. I'm just a waitress at a diner in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing special about me or my blood, so you're gonna have to try harder than that. It's not about who you are now, he said, his voice lowering. It's about who you come from. Tessa stared at him, her mind racing. Her family, was he serious? Her parents had always been simple people. They'd never hinted at anything remotely strange or supernatural. She wanted to call him insane, but the memory of those claws, the glowing eyes, and the sound of that blade cutting through the creature flashed in her mind. What does my family have to do with this? She asked, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. Your bloodline carries something ancient, he said. A connection to the hollow, one something they crave, something they can't have. Her stomach twisted. You're making it sound like I'm cursed or something. It's not a curse, he said carefully. It's complicated, but you need to trust me when I say you're not safe here anymore. If we stay, more of them will come, and the next time I might not be able to stop them. The weight of his words sank in, chilling her to the bone. Why should I trust you? She asked, her voice quieter now. He stepped closer, his expression softening for the first time since she'd met him. Because if I wanted to hurt you, I could have done it already. And because I'm the only one who knows how to keep you alive. The distant sound of shattering glass cut through the air, jolting them both. Tessa's eyes widened. The front of the diner they're here, he interrupted, pulling her attention back to him. His voice was urgent but calm. We need to move. Now. What about the diner? She blurted. It's not safe anymore, he said bluntly, already heading for the back door. He stopped when she didn't follow. Tessa. She flinched at the sound of her name coming from him. She hadn't told him her name. How do you know who I am? She asked, her voice sharp. His expression flickered, but he didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the door. I'll explain later. Right now, we have to go. Another snarl rang out, louder this time, followed by heavy, deliberate footsteps. Her heart pounded as her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. Tessa, he said again, his voice softer but no less insistent. Please. There was something in his tone that cut through her fear, something raw and almost pleading. Against her better judgment, she stepped forward, letting him guide her toward the door. The rain hit them like a wall the moment they stepped outside, cold and relentless. The parking lot was empty, the only sounds the pounding rain and the echo of their footsteps. Where are we going? She asked, struggling to keep up as he led her toward a dark sedan parked near the edge of the lot. Somewhere they can't follow, he said cryptically, unlocking the car with a quick flick of his wrist. Before she could question him further, a loud crash came from behind them. Tessa turned, her blood running cold as she saw another creature bigger than the first climbing out through the shattered diner window. Its eyes burned brighter, and its claws gleamed in the rain as it let out a guttural roar. Get in, the stranger ordered, his voice tight. Tessa didn't need to be told twice. She dove into the passenger seat as he slid behind the wheel, slamming the door just as the creature charged toward them. The engine roared to life, and the car shot forward, tires skidding on the slick pavement. The creature was fast, faster than anything that size had any right to be, and it chased them down the road with terrifying ease. Is it going to catch us? Tessa asked, her voice shaking. Not if I can help it, he said, gripping the wheel tightly. The glowing mark on his arm flared faintly, and the blade now resting on the console between them seemed to hum in response. Tessa stared at it, her mind spinning with questions she wasn't sure she wanted the answers to. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. It was just beginning. Chapter 3. A marked man, the rain lashed against the windshield as the car sped down the empty highway, the headlights cutting through the dark. Tessa gripped the edge of her seat, her heart pounding as she glanced in the side mirror. The creature was still behind them, its monstrous form barely visible through the haze of rain and darkness, but the sound of its guttural snarls carried on the wind, growing louder. "How is it still keeping up?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The stranger didn't take his eyes off the road. "Hollow ones are persistent. They don't stop unless you make them stop." "Great," Tessa muttered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's comforting." He didn't respond. Instead, he pressed his foot harder on the gas, the engine growling in protest as the car surged forward. The road twisted and turned, flanked on either side by endless fields, but the creature didn't falter. It moved with an unnatural speed, its claws gouging the asphalt as it closed the distance between them. "Do something," Tessa shouted, panic rising in her chest. "I am," he snapped. With a sharp jerk of the wheel, he veered off the road and onto a narrow dirt path that cut through the trees. The car jolted violently, the tires slipping on the wet mud, but the stranger didn't slow down. "What are you doing?" Tessa demanded, gripping the door to steady herself. "Losing it," he said, his voice tense. She risked another glance behind them. The creature had disappeared from view, but she could still feel an oppressive weight in the air, a sense of being hunted that made her skin crawl. The car burst through the trees into a clearing, skidding to a halt in the middle of an open field. The stranger killed the engine, plunging them into a tense silence broken only by the sound of rain pounding on the roof. "Why are we stopping?" Tessa asked, her voice high and strained. "Because it's going to find us anyway," he said, reaching for the blade on the console. "And it's better if I deal with it now, away from anyone else." She stared at him in disbelief. "You're seriously going to fight that thing? Alone? Yes, that's insane." "Do you have a better idea?" He shot back, his tone sharp. Tessa opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, the creature emerged from the trees. It was bigger than she remembered, its hulking frame glistening with rain, its burning eyes locked onto the car. It let out a guttural roar, the sound reverberating through the clearing, and Tessa felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. The stranger opened the door and stepped out, the blade glinting faintly in his hand. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice firm. "Are you kidding? I'm not staying in the car with that out there." He shot her a sharp look. "You'll only slow me down. Stay." "Here." Before she could argue, he slammed the door shut, leaving her in stunned silence. Through the rain-blurred windshield, she watched as he faced the creature, his posture calm and steady despite the impossible odds. The blade in his hand seemed to glow brighter, casting an otherworldly light across the clearing. The creature lunged. The stranger moved faster than she thought humanly possible, sidestepping the attack with a fluid grace that bordered on supernatural. The blade arced through the air, slicing into the creature's side, and it let out a deafening snarl, its claws swiping at him with deadly precision. Tessa couldn't look away, her breath caught in her throat as the fight unfolded. The stranger fought with a skill and ferocity that seemed unreal, his movements precise and calculated. But the creature was relentless, its strength and speed pushing him to the edge. For a moment, it looked like he had the upper hand. The blade slashed across the creature's chest, sending a spray of dark, viscous blood into the rain. But the victory was short-lived. The creature lashed out with its massive claws, catching him across the shoulder and sending him sprawling to the ground. "No," Tessa shouted, her instincts overriding her fear. Before she realized what she was doing, she threw open the car door and ran into the rain. The stranger was struggling to his feet, blood dripping from his shoulder, but the creature was already closing in. "Get back in the car," he shouted, his voice rough with pain. But Tessa didn't listen. Her eyes darted around the clearing, landing on a broken tree branch lying in the mud. Without thinking, she grabbed it and hurled it at the creature with all her strength. It wasn't much, but it was enough to distract it. The creature snarled and turned toward her, its burning eyes narrowing. "Tessa, no," the stranger shouted, his voice laced with panic. The creature lunged at her, faster than she could react. But before it could reach her, the stranger was there, throwing himself between them. The blade flashed in the dim light, and the creature let out a final, ear-splitting roar before collapsing to the ground, its body dissolving into a pool of black smoke. Tessa stared in shock, her chest heaving as the rain soaked through her clothes. The clearing was silent again, save for the sound of her ragged breathing. The stranger turned to her, his expression a mix of relief and anger. "I told you to stay in the car," he said, his voice low and strained. "You're welcome," she shot back, her fear giving way to defiance. For a moment, he just stared at her, his green eyes unreadable. Then he sighed, shaking his head. "You're going to get yourself killed," he muttered, sheathing the blade. She crossed her arms, ignoring the rain dripping down her face. "Maybe if someone explained what the hell is going on, I wouldn't have to throw tree branches at monsters." His lips twitched, though she couldn't tell if it was amusement or frustration. "Fair point." He gestured toward the car, his movements slower now, weighed down by exhaustion. "Let's get out of here before more show up. I'll explain on the way." Tessa hesitated, then followed him back to the car, her mind racing with questions she wasn't sure she wanted the answers to. But one thing was clear: her life would never be the same again. Chapter 4, Echoes of the Past. The sound of the rain was a steady rhythm against the car's roof as they drove back onto the main road. The tires hummed against the slick pavement, but inside the car, the silence was thick and charged. Tessa sat with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching the stranger out of the corner of her eye. He was pale, his jaw clenched tightly as he gripped the steering wheel with one hand. His other hand rested on his thigh, blood slowly seeping through his jacket where the creature's claws had ripped into him. "You're hurt," Tessa said, breaking the silence. "I'm fine," he replied curtly, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "No, you're not." She frowned, glancing at the glistening stains spreading across the fabric. "You need to stop and take care of that." "I'll deal with it when we're safe," he said. Tessa leaned back, her frustration mounting. He hadn't said a word since they left the clearing, and the tension in the car was unbearable. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. "Okay, no," she said, turning to face him fully. "You don't get to just sit there bleeding all over the place and act like I'm supposed to be fine with everything that just happened. You owe me an explanation. Who are you? What were those things? And why the hell are they after me?" He sighed, his grip on the wheel tightening. For a long moment he didn't say anything, and Tessa thought he might ignore her entirely. But then he spoke. "My name is Callan," he said quietly. "I'm a hunter." "A hunter," Tessa repeated, her voice flat. "You mean like deer and stuff?" "Because that thing back there was definitely not that kind of hunter," he interrupted. His tone was sharp, but there was a weariness to it too. "I hunt things like the hollow ones, creatures that don't belong in this world." Tessa blinked, trying to process that. "So what? You're like some kind of supernatural exterminator." Callan gave a humorless chuckle, "if you want to put it that way." "And those hollow ones," she said, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "They don't belong in this world. What does that mean?" "It means they come from somewhere else," he said. "A place beyond ours. A void. They're not supposed to be here, but something has been pulling them through. Something powerful." Tessa stared at him, her mind spinning. None of this made any sense. And what does that have to do with me? He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Your bloodline," he said finally. "You come from a family that's tied to all of this. I don't know the full details yet, but the hollow ones are drawn to that connection." "To you." "My bloodline," Tessa repeated, shaking her head. "You keep saying that, but it doesn't make any sense. My family is normal. We run a diner, for crying out loud. There's nothing special about us." Callan glanced at her, his green eyes sharp. "Are you sure about that?" "Yes," she said, her frustration bubbling over. "At least I was. Now you're telling me monsters are after me because of something in my family's past, and I'm supposed to just..." She stopped abruptly, a memory flashing in her mind. Her mother's voice, quiet but firm, saying, "We don't talk about the past, Tessa. Some things are better left buried." Tessa frowned, her hands tightening into fists, My mom, she began, her voice faltering. She always avoided talking about our family history. I thought it was just because she didn't want to bring up old drama or something, but maybe it was because she was trying to protect you, Callan finished, his tone softer now. The thought sent a chill through her. Was it possible? Had her mom known about this? About the creatures, the danger? What about this mark? She asked, nodding toward his arm. What does it do? Why did it light up when you fought that thing? Callan hesitated, his fingers flexing around the steering wheel. Finally, he rolled up his sleeve, revealing the swirling black mark etched into his skin. Even in the dim light, it seemed to pulse faintly, as though it were alive. It's a sigil, he said. A binding mark. It's how I fight them. It channels power enough to hurt them, kill them, but it's not without cost. What kind of cost? Callan's expression darkened. The more I use it, the more it takes from me. Strength, energy, sometimes more than that. Tessa stared at him, her unease growing. That sounds dangerous. It is, he said simply, rolling his sleeve back down, but it's the only way to stop them. The car slowed as they approached an old, abandoned gas station on the side of the road. Callan pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening. Why are we stopping? Tessa asked, glancing around. We need to regroup, Callan said, unbuckling his seatbelt. And I need to patch this up before I bleed out. Tessa watched as he climbed out of the car, grabbing a small bag from the back seat. She followed him reluctantly, pulling her jacket tighter around herself as the rain continued to fall. Inside, the gas station was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of mildew. Callan set his bag on a dusty counter and pulled out a first aid kit, his movements methodical. You've done this before, Tessa said, leaning against the wall. Too many times, he replied, wincing as he pulled his jacket off to reveal the gash on his shoulder. She watched as he cleaned the wound, her mind still racing. What now? She asked quietly. What am I supposed to do? Callan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. We find out what your family was hiding, and we figure out why the hollow ones are after you. And then what? Then we stop them, he said simply. Tessa nodded, though the weight of his words settled heavily on her chest. She didn't know what her family's past would reveal, but one thing was certain: her quiet life in Willow Creek was over. Chapter 5. The packs warning the storm had settled into a steady drizzle by the time they left the gas station. Tessa sat in the passenger seat, her legs pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around them. She had too many questions, but every time she tried to ask, her throat tightened, as if voicing her fears would make all of this more real. Callan was quieter now, his movements slower as he drove through the winding backroads of Willow Creek. The rain had soaked through his shirt while he patched his wound, and his face was pale, but he still had that unshakable focus in his green eyes. Tessa broke the silence. Where are we going? To someone who might have answers, Callan said. She frowned. Who? A pack, he replied. Her heart skipped a beat. Like wolves? Not exactly, he said, glancing at her. They're werewolves. They've lived in the area for generations. If anyone knows what's drawing the hollow ones to Willow Creek, it's them. Tessa stared at him, her mind reeling. She'd barely managed to wrap her head around the existence of monsters like the hollow ones. Now she had to deal with werewolves. Right, she said, her voice laced with sarcasm, because that's totally normal. It's not normal, Callan said, his tone patient but firm, but it's real. And if you want to survive, you need to start accepting that. She wanted to argue, to push back against the absurdity of everything he was saying, but the memory of the creature's fiery eyes and claws shut her up. Fine, she muttered. But if they try to eat me, I'm blaming you. Callan smirked, the first hint of humor she'd seen from him. They won't. Probably. Comforting, she muttered, slumping back in her seat. The woods were dense and shadowy when Callan finally pulled the car onto a narrow dirt path. The headlights barely pierced the thick fog that clung to the trees, and Tessa felt her unease growing with every passing second. Are you sure this is a good idea? She asked, her voice quieter now. It's our only option, Callan replied. The car rolled to a stop in front of a small clearing. In the dim light, Tessa could just make out a series of wooden cabins scattered among the trees. Smoke curled lazily from a chimney in the largest one, and the faint glow of lanterns lit the windows. They don't like strangers, Callan warned as he stepped out of the car. Let me do the talking. Tessa hesitated, then followed him. The air was damp and cold, and the forest seemed alive with unseen movement. She stuck close to Callan, her eyes darting to every shadow. The first wolf appeared out of nowhere, stepping silently from the trees. It was massive, its fur a silvery gray that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Its golden eyes locked onto Tessa, and she froze, her breath catching in her throat. Another wolf emerged, then another, their forms eerily graceful as they flanked the clearing. Stay calm, Callan murmured, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his blade. The wolves didn't attack. Instead, they stood watch as a man emerged from the largest cabin. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair pulled back into a loose braid. His eyes were sharp and amber, glowing faintly in the dim light. Callan, the man said, his deep voice carrying easily through the clearing. You've got nerve coming here. I didn't have a choice, Adrian, Callan replied. Adrian's gaze shifted to Tessa, his expression hardening. And who's this? She's the reason I'm here, Callan said. Adrian frowned, his sharp eyes narrowing. You brought a human into my territory. She's not just a human, Callan said, his tone steady. The hollow ones are after her. The tension in the clearing shifted immediately. The wolves growled low in their throats, their golden eyes fixed on Tessa with newfound intensity. Adrian's expression darkened. Are you saying she's the one they've been hunting? Yes, Callan said, and I think you know why. Adrian was silent for a long moment, his gaze flicking between Callan and Tessa. Finally, he turned and gestured for them to follow. Come inside, he said. We'll talk. The cabin was warm and dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of burning wood. Tessa sat stiffly on an old leather couch, her hands gripping the edge of the cushion. Callan leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, while Adrian stood near the fireplace, his presence commanding even in stillness. You've brought trouble to my pack, Adrian said, his tone laced with accusation. I didn't bring anything, Callan replied. The trouble found her. Adrian's sharp gaze turned to Tessa. What's your name? Tessa, she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Tessa, Adrian repeated, his tone unreadable. Do you have any idea what you've brought down on us? She opened her mouth to respond, but Callan cut in. She doesn't know anything. That's why we're here to figure out what's going on. Adrian studied her for a moment longer, then sighed, running a hand through his hair. This isn't the first time the Hollow Ones have come to Willow Creek, he said finally. Tessa blinked, startled. What do you mean? Adrian glanced at her, his expression grim. Your family has a history here, Tessa. A long one, and it's tied to the Hollow Ones in ways you can't begin to understand. Her stomach twisted. What kind of history? Adrian hesitated, his gaze flickering to Callan. It's not my story to tell. But if the Hollow Ones are after you, it means they think you're connected to whatever brought them here in the first place. Tessa's chest tightened. What do they want from me? They want to consume you, Adrian said bluntly. Her breath caught. They're drawn to power, Adrian continued. And whether you realize it or not, you have it, enough to make you a target. Tessa stared at him, her mind spinning. Power. She didn't have power. She was just a waitress in a small-town diner. This is insane, she whispered. It doesn't matter if you believe it or not, Adrian said. What matters is that the Hollow Ones do, and they won't stop until they get what they want. Silence filled the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire. What do we do now? Tessa asked, her voice trembling. Adrian's amber eyes met hers, his expression unreadable. You fight, he said, or you run, but either way, you're not safe anymore. Chapter 6, Secrets Beneath the Moonlight. The moon hung low over the forest, its light filtering through the thick canopy of trees as Callan and Tessa followed Adrian down a winding path. The tension from the cabin still lingered, and Tessa couldn't shake the weight of Adrian's words. You fight or you run. But either way, you're not safe anymore. She wanted to argue, to demand answers that made sense, but the deeper they ventured into the woods, the more a strange energy settled over her, a hum beneath her skin, faint but undeniable. What's out here? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Something your family left behind, Adrian said without turning around. That's not exactly specific, Tessa muttered, earning a small smirk from Callan as he walked beside her. You'll see soon enough, Adrian said. Tessa bit back another question, focusing instead on her surroundings. The woods were eerily quiet, the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves replaced by an oppressive stillness. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself as they continued deeper into the trees. Finally, Adrian stopped in front of a massive oak tree, its gnarled roots twisting into the ground like frozen tendrils. He knelt, brushing aside the leaves and dirt to reveal a weathered stone slab embedded in the earth. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, their edges worn but still faintly glowing in the moonlight. What is this? Tessa asked, stepping closer. It's an entrance, Adrian said, his voice quieter now, to something your family hid long ago. The Hollow Ones have been trying to reach it for decades. Tessa stared at the slab, her chest tightening. Why? Adrian straightened, his amber eyes meeting hers. Because what's buried here holds the power to destroy them or to make them unstoppable. Her stomach twisted, and my family was responsible for whatever this is. Adrian nodded. Your ancestors sealed it away generations ago after the Hollow Ones first crossed into this world. They paid a heavy price to protect it. What kind of price? Tessa asked. Adrian hesitated, glancing at Callan. Lives, Callan said grimly, sacrifices, binding rituals. Whatever it took to keep the void from spreading. Tessa felt a cold lump form in her throat. This couldn't be real. Her family, her parents, her grandparents, they'd never spoken of anything remotely like this. They were just normal people running a diner in the middle of nowhere. Adrian must have sensed her disbelief. Your family hid the truth for a reason, he said. They thought they could keep you safe by keeping you ignorant. Well, that worked out great, she said bitterly. Adrian didn't respond. Instead, he knelt again, pressing his palm against the center of the stone. The glowing symbols pulsed faintly, and a low rumble vibrated through the ground. Tessa stumbled back, her heart racing as the slab shifted, sliding aside to reveal a dark, narrow staircase leading into the earth. Stay close, Adrian said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Tessa hesitated, glancing at Callan. He gave her a reassuring nod, his green eyes steady despite the tension in his posture. With a deep breath, she followed Adrian down the steps, the air growing colder with every step. The walls were lined with strange carvings, the same glowing symbols from the stone above etched into the rough stone. What is this place? She asked, her voice echoing faintly in the narrow space. A sanctuary, Adrian said, and a prison. Tessa frowned. Prison for what? They reached the bottom of the stairs, stepping into a cavernous chamber that took her breath away. The walls were covered in intricate murals, depicting scenes of battle and sacrifice. At the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, and on it rested a small, ornate box. For this, Adrian said, nodding toward the box. Tessa stepped closer, drawn to the strange object. The box was made of dark, polished wood, its surface inlaid with shimmering silver patterns that seemed to shift and move as she looked at them. What's in it? She asked, her voice hushed. No one knows for sure, Adrian said, but it's powerful enough that your ancestors thought it was worth dying for. Callan stepped forward, his expression grim, and the Hollow Ones want it. If they get their hands on whatever's inside, they'll rip this world apart. Tessa stared at the box, her heart pounding. She didn't want to believe any of this, but the energy radiating from the object was undeniable. It called to her, a faint, insistent pull that made her head spin. What happens now? She asked, tearing her gaze away. Adrian's expression darkened. Now we figure out how to keep it safe and how to stop the hollow ones from coming after you. Isn't that why my family sealed it away? Tessa asked. Shouldn't we just leave it here? We can't, Callan said. The hollow ones know where it is now. It's only a matter of time before they try to break in. Tessa's stomach churned. So what do we do? Adrian exchanged a tense look with Callan before turning back to her. The box is tied to you, Tessa. Your family's blood sealed it, which means only your blood can move it. If we're going to protect it, you have to be the one to take it. Her heart stopped. You're kidding, right? I don't even know what I'm doing. You'll learn, Callan said, his voice steady. I'll teach you. This is insane, she whispered, her hands trembling. It's your choice, Adrian said, his tone softer now. But if you don't take it, the hollow ones will. And then there won't be anything left to fight for. Tessa closed her eyes, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She didn't ask for this. She didn't want any of it. But deep down, she knew they were right. When she opened her eyes, her gaze was steady. What do I need to do? She asked. Adrian nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Take the box, he said simply. Tessa stepped forward, her heart pounding as she reached out. The moment her fingers brushed the surface of the box, a surge of energy shot through her, warm and electric. The silver patterns flared brightly, and for a brief moment, the murals on the walls seemed to come alive, the figures moving and shifting. And then it was over. Tessa stumbled back, clutching the box to her chest as the glow faded. The room fell silent, the air heavy with a sense of finality. Adrian and Callan were watching her, their expressions a mix of awe and caution. It's done, Adrian said. Now the real fight begins. Tessa swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the box. She didn't know what she'd just unleashed, but one thing was certain. There was no turning back now. Chapter 7, The Forgotten Ritual. The drive back to town was tense, the box resting heavily on Tessa's lap. She kept her hands on it, her fingers tracing the swirling silver patterns that seemed to hum faintly beneath her touch. She didn't know why she had taken it, why she'd felt compelled to, but the moment it left the pedestal, a strange, unshakable certainty had settled over her. This was hers to carry. What's in it? She asked for the 100th time, breaking the silence. We don't know, Callan said, his voice tired but steady. No one does. But whatever it is, it's tied to the hollow ones. Its power, pure and dangerous. Adrian, who was driving, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. That's why your ancestors locked it away. They didn't trust anyone, not even themselves, with what's inside. So why not destroy it? Tessa asked. You can't destroy what you don't understand, Adrian said simply. Tessa frowned, her gaze dropping to the box. The silver lines shimmered faintly in the dim light, as though they were alive, responding to her presence. Why does it feel like it's connected to me? She asked softly. It is, Callan said, turning to look at her. It's bound to your bloodline, that's why the hollow ones are after you. They think you're the key to unlocking it. Tessa shivered, her grip tightening. She wanted to throw the box into the nearest river and forget any of this had happened, but she knew that wouldn't solve anything. What happens if they get it? She asked. They'll tear it open, Adrian said grimly. And whatever's inside, whatever power it holds, will destroy this world. Tessa swallowed hard, her pulse racing. She looked out the window, the familiar streets of Willow Creek now cast in an unfamiliar, eerie light. This was her home, her world, and now it felt impossibly fragile. What do we do now? She asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to sound steady. Adrian didn't answer, but Callan's expression hardened. We find out what your family knew. There has to be something, a ritual, a spell, anything that can stop the hollow ones from getting to you or the box. Tessa thought back to her parents, her mind racing. They'd always been quiet about their past, brushing off her questions with vague answers and tight smiles. Her mom's words echoed in her head, we don't talk about the past, Tessa. Some things are better left buried. Maybe they weren't just being secretive. Maybe they were protecting her. I think there's something at the diner, she said suddenly. Adrian raised an eyebrow. The diner? She nodded. My mom used to keep this old journal. I saw her writing in it all the time when I was a kid, but she never let me look at it. She kept it in her office, locked up in a drawer. That's a start, Callan said. If your mom knew anything, it might be in there. Tessa hesitated, a lump forming in her throat. She's not there anymore. Neither of them are. The weight of her parents' absence hit her like a wave, but she pushed it aside. She couldn't afford to fall apart now. I'll get the journal, she said firmly. Adrian nodded, his amber eyes thoughtful. We'll go with you. If the hollow ones know where the box is, they'll be watching you. It won't be safe. Tessa didn't argue. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she could trust the shadows outside her door. The diner looked almost peaceful as they pulled into the parking lot. The neon sign buzzed faintly in the rain, its glow casting long reflections across the wet asphalt. It was hard to believe this was the same place where everything had fallen apart just hours earlier. The three of them moved quickly, slipping through the back entrance. The diner was dark, the chairs still stacked on the tables, the scent of coffee and grease lingering in the air. "Where's the office?" Callan asked, his voice low. "This way," Tessa said, leading them past the counter and down a narrow hallway. Her mom's office was at the very end, a small, cramped space filled with filing cabinets and old receipts. She flicked on the light, her eyes landing on the desk. The drawer she needed was locked, just as she remembered. "Here," she said, kneeling in front of it. Callan crouched beside her, pulling a small, wicked-looking knife from his belt. "Mind if I break this?" "Go ahead," she said, stepping back. It took him less than a minute to pop the lock. The drawer slid open with a faint creak, revealing a neatly stacked collection of papers, envelopes, and at the very bottom a worn leather journal. Tessa reached for it, her fingers trembling. The journal was heavier than she expected, its cover smooth and warm to the touch. She opened it carefully, the faint scent of ink and aged paper rising as she flipped through the pages. The handwriting was her mother's elegant and precise, the same script she'd seen on countless grocery lists and birthday cards. But the words written here were unlike anything she'd ever seen. Strange symbols lined the margins, interspersed with sketches of creatures that sent a chill down her spine. There were notes about rituals, spells, and something called the binding chain. "What is this?" she whispered, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar text. "It's a guide," Callan said, leaning over her shoulder. "Your family's knowledge of the hollow ones, written down and passed on." Tessa flipped to a page near the middle and froze. There, scrawled in bold, hurried handwriting, were the words "The seal will not hold forever. When it fails, the bearer must be ready." Her stomach dropped. "The seal," she said, her voice barely audible. "They're talking about the box. Your mother knew this was coming," Adrian said quietly. Tessa stared at the journal, the weight of it pressing down on her like a stone. Her mom had known. She'd kept this secret, hidden it away, and now it was all falling on her shoulders. "Keep reading," Callan said, his voice tense. She nodded, flipping through the pages. Her eyes landed on a series of instructions, accompanied by a diagram of a glowing circle surrounded by runes. "This," she said, pointing to the page. "It looks like some kind of ritual." Callan studied it, his expression darkening. "It's a warding spell," he said. "A way to keep the hollow ones at bay. Can we do it?" she asked, hope flickering in her chest. Callan hesitated. "We can try. But it's complicated. If even one thing goes wrong, it won't," she said firmly. He raised an eyebrow. "You sound sure." Tessa met his gaze, determination flaring in her eyes. "Because I don't have a choice." Adrian's voice cut through the silence, low and steady. "We'll need supplies. And time. Then we'd better get started," Tessa said, clutching the journal tightly. She didn't know if the ritual would work, but it was a chance, a fragile, desperate chance to fight back. And she wasn't going to waste it. Chapter 8. A hunter's packed Tessa felt the weight of the journal like a stone in her hands as they left the diner and drove toward the edge of town. The ritual she'd found was intricate and terrifying, involving symbols, ancient words, and objects she couldn't even identify. But as impossible as it seemed, The urgency in Adrian's and Callan's voices told her there was no time to question it. Callan had explained the plan on the way. They'd prepare the warding spell tonight if they could find the materials and use it to protect her and the box. It wouldn't be a permanent solution, but it would buy them time to figure out what her family had started and, maybe, how to end it. The car slowed as Adrian pulled into the gravel lot of a run-down cabin tucked away in the woods. The place looked abandoned, its wooden exterior weathered and streaked with moss, but the light in Adrian's amber eyes said otherwise. "What is this place?" Tessa asked, stepping out into the cold night air. "Safe house," Adrian said shortly. "My pack keeps it stocked for emergencies, and this qualifies as an emergency." Adrian glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You're carrying a box that could end the world." "What do you think?" Tessa didn't answer. She followed them inside, shivering as the cold seeped through her jacket. The interior was sparse but functional: an old couch and a small kitchen, a heavy wooden table in the center of the room. Adrian moved to a locked cabinet near the wall, pulling it open to reveal shelves lined with jars of herbs, vials of strange liquids, and neatly labeled bags of powders. "Everything we need should be here," Adrian said, scanning the contents. Tessa frowned as she looked over his shoulder. "This is a lot of stuff for emergencies." "We don't exactly deal with normal emergencies," Adrian said dryly, pulling out a small leather pouch and handing it to Callan. Callan emptied the pouch onto the table, revealing a handful of shimmering stones, each etched with faint markings. "Rune stones," he explained, holding one up. "They'll amplify the ritual if we use them correctly." Tessa reached out, brushing her fingers against one of the stones. It was cool and smooth, its surface humming faintly beneath her touch. "And if we don't use them correctly, they'll explode," Callan said matter-of-factly. Tessa pulled her hand back quickly. Adrian smirked as he continued gathering supplies: chalk, candles, a silver knife, and laid them out on the table. "Let's hope you're a quick learner." The ritual preparation took hours. Adrian and Callan worked methodically, sketching the intricate symbols and runes from the journal onto the cabin floor in chalk. Tessa tried to help, but her hands shook every time she picked up the chalk, and the weight of the box on the table seemed to grow heavier with every passing moment. "You okay?" Callan asked quietly, glancing at her as he finished drawing the final symbol. Tessa nodded, though her chest felt tight. "Yeah, just processing." He studied her for a moment, then set the chalk down and leaned against the table. "You're doing better than most people would in your situation." "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" she asked, a small smile tugging at her lips despite everything. "It's the truth," he said, his tone soft. Their eyes met, and for a moment the weight of the night seemed to lessen. But then Adrian's voice broke the silence. "We're ready." Tessa turned, her stomach twisting as she looked at the intricate circle on the floor. The runes glowed faintly, the light flickering like fire, and the candles placed around the perimeter cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. "What now?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. "Now," Adrian said, stepping into the circle, "you place the box in the center, and we activate the ward." Tessa's hands trembled as she picked up the box. It felt heavier than before, its humming energy stronger, more insistent. She stepped carefully into the circle, kneeling in the center and setting the box on the ground. The moment it touched the chalk, the runes flared brighter, and a low vibration rippled through the air. Adrian and Callan moved to opposite sides of the circle, each holding a rune stone. They began chanting, their voices low and rhythmic, the unfamiliar words resonating in the small space. Tessa's chest tightened as the air grew heavier, the light from the runes growing brighter, more erratic. The candles flickered wildly, and the box began to pulse, its silver patterns glowing like molten metal. "What's happening?" she asked, panic rising in her voice. "Stay still," Adrian commanded, his voice sharp. The vibration grew stronger, and Tessa's ears filled with a low, droning hum. The runes on the floor twisted and shifted, the glowing light spiraling upward like a vortex. She gritted her teeth, her hands gripping the floor to steady herself as the energy swirled around her. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The room fell silent, the air heavy with a strange electric charge. The runes on the floor glowed steadily now, their light soft and warm, and the box sat motionless in the center of the circle. "It worked," Callan said, his voice filled with cautious relief. Tessa let out a shaky breath, her heart racing. "So we're safe." "For now," Adrian said, his tone grim. Before Tessa could respond, a loud crash echoed from outside, followed by a low, guttural snarl. Her blood ran cold. What was that? Adrian's eyes darkened. "They're here." Callan was already moving, grabbing the silver knife from the table and handing Tessa a smaller blade. "Stay behind us," he said firmly. The snarls grew louder, and Tessa's pulse thundered in her ears as the door shuddered violently, claws raking against the wood. Adrian stepped forward, his amber eyes glowing as he shifted partially into his wolf form, his teeth bared. "Protect the box," he growled. "No matter what." The door splintered, and the first creature lunged inside. Tessa gripped the knife tightly, her back pressed against the table as chaos erupted around her. Callan moved like lightning, his glowing blade slicing through the creature's dark, writhing form, but more poured in behind it, their eyes burning like coals. Adrian charged into the fray, his claws slashing through the darkness, but the creatures kept coming, their guttural growls filling the cabin. Tessa's breath came in short gasps as she clutched the box to her chest, the runes on the floor glowing brighter in response. The energy pulsing through the circle was stronger now, a sharp, insistent rhythm that matched the pounding of her heart. One of the creatures broke through the fight, its fiery eyes locking onto her. It lunged, its claws outstretched, and the box flared with blinding light. The creature shrieked, its form dissolving into smoke as the light consumed it. Tessa stared, stunned, as the runes flared brighter, the energy surging outward and driving the remaining creatures back. When the light finally faded, the cabin was silent. Adrian and Callan stood in the wreckage, their breathing heavy, their weapons dripping with dark, viscous blood. Tessa clutched the box, her hands trembling. What just happened? Callan looked at her, his green eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. "The box protected you," he said. Adrian nodded, his expression grim. "But it won't stop them forever." Tessa swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the box. The fight wasn't over, not even close. And she was starting to realize that the box wasn't just a burden. It was a weapon. Chapter 9. A town of secrets. Willow Creek was quieter than usual the next morning, a hush falling over the small town that felt almost unnatural. Tessa stood on the porch of the safe house, the box still in her hands. The early light spilled through the trees, casting long shadows across the yard, but even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. Callan and Adrian were inside, patching up the damage from the previous night. Tessa hadn't been able to sleep, not after watching the box unleash that blinding light, not after seeing the hollow ones reduced to smoke and ash. She felt a strange pull now, an undeniable connection to the box that made her chest ache and her thoughts race. It wasn't just an object anymore, it was a piece of her, a piece of whatever had been hidden in her family's bloodline for generations. The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. Callan stepped onto the porch, his green eyes sharp but tired. He leaned against the railing, crossing his arms as he looked out at the trees. "You okay?" he asked. Tessa hesitated, then nodded. "I don't know," she admitted. "Everything's happening so fast, I don't even know where to start." Callan's gaze softened. "I get it," he said. "I've been in your shoes before. Maybe not exactly your shoes, but close enough." Tessa raised an eyebrow. "Oh, yeah. You were hunted by monsters and carrying a magical box that could end the world." He chuckled softly. "Not quite. But I've seen what it's like to have your life turned upside down overnight, to suddenly be part of something bigger than yourself." She studied him for a moment, trying to imagine what his life must have been like before all of this. "How did you end up doing this?" she asked, gesturing vaguely. Callan's expression darkened slightly. I grew up in a family of hunters. My parents, my siblings, we were all trained to fight the things that go bump in the night. But when the hollow ones showed up, everything changed. What happened? He hesitated, his jaw tightening. They took everything. My family, my home. I made it my mission to stop them after that. Tessa's chest tightened at the raw edge in his voice. She wanted to say something to comfort him, but before she could, Adrian appeared in the doorway, his sharp gaze cutting through the tension. "We need to move," he said. "Move where?" Tessa asked, standing straighter. "To town," Adrian replied. "There's more going on here than we realized. If we're going to understand what's happening, we need answers, and we won't find them hiding out in the woods." They arrived in Willow Creek just as the town was starting to wake. The streets were quiet, but there was an undercurrent of unease in the air. Tessa noticed people glancing over their shoulders, locking their doors, and whispering in hushed tones. "Do they know?" she asked as they walked down Main Street. Adrian shook his head. "Not exactly, but they can feel it. Ordinary people might not understand what's happening, but they can sense when something's wrong." Tessa's stomach churned as she spotted her family's diner at the end of the street. The bell above the door jingled as they stepped inside, and the familiar scent of coffee and bacon filled the air. It was strange to see it so quiet. No customers, no friendly chatter. Just the hum of the lights and the faint creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. "What are we looking for?" Tessa asked, clutching the journal tightly. "Anything that ties your family to the hollow ones," Adrian said, scanning the room. "Old records, letters, anything that might give us a clue." Tessa hesitated, then nodded, leading them to the back office. She opened the drawer where they'd found the journal the night before, rifling through the remaining papers and receipts. Callan joined her, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "What about the building itself?" he asked. "Anything hidden in the walls?" "Floorboards." Tessa frowned, thinking back to her childhood. She remembered playing in the office while her mom worked, the way her parents always seemed to keep certain areas off limits. "There's a storage room upstairs," she said. "We weren't allowed in there much." Adrian nodded. "Let's check it out." The storage room was cramped and dusty, filled with boxes of old menus, holiday decorations, and worn-out equipment. Tessa wrinkled her nose as she stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of mildew. "Start with the back wall," Adrian said, motioning for Tessa and Callan to search while he stood guard at the door. Tessa crouched down, opening one of the boxes. Most of it was junk-yellowed receipts, broken coffee mugs, but as she reached the bottom, her fingers brushed against something cold and metal. She pulled it out carefully, her breath catching. It was a small, rusted lockbox, the kind that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. "What's that?" Callan asked, kneeling beside her. "I don't know," Tessa said, brushing the dust off the lid. The lock was broken, and she pried it open with little effort. Inside, she found a stack of old photographs and a yellowed envelope sealed with wax. She picked up the envelope first, her heart racing as she read the words scrawled across the front to the bearer of the box. Tessa swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was delicate and familiar her mother's. "If you're reading this, it means the seal has failed. It means the hollow ones have returned. I'm sorry. We tried to protect you, to keep you from the burden our family has carried for generations. But some things cannot be escaped. The box is more than a relic. It is a key to destruction or salvation, and only the bearer can decide which. You are stronger than you know, Tessa. And you are not alone. Trust the allies you find along the way. They will guide you. But beware, not everyone who claims to stand with you can be trusted. The box has always drawn darkness to it. Protect it with your life. And if the time comes, be ready to use it." The letter ended abruptly, leaving Tessa's heart pounding. "Use it," she whispered, her voice shaking. "What does that mean?" Callan asked, his brow furrowing. Tessa shook her head, staring at the letter. Her mother's words were heavy with finality, as though she'd known this moment would come and that Tessa would be the one to face it. Adrian stepped forward, his expression grim. "It means we don't have time to waste. If your mom knew the hollow ones would come for the box, she might have left more clues behind. We need to dig deeper." Tessa nodded, tucking the letter into the journal. Her hands still shook, but the fear had been replaced by something else: determination. The hollow ones wanted the box. They wanted her. But she wasn't going to make it easy for them. Chapter 10, Blood on the Wind. The air outside the diner was still, unnervingly so. The faint drizzle from earlier had stopped, and the streets of Willow Creek were empty, bathed in the pale, diffused light of an overcast sky. Tessa clutched the journal and the letter tightly, her mind racing with questions she didn't have time to answer. "Do you think she knew this would happen?" she asked Callan as they walked toward the car parked in the alley behind the diner. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Your mother. Maybe. She might not have known when, but it sounds like she knew it was inevitable." Adrian, walking ahead of them, stopped abruptly. His head tilted slightly, his body going rigid as though he'd heard something neither of them could. "What is it?" Callan asked, his voice low. Adrian sniffed the air, his amber eyes narrowing. "Blood." Tessa's stomach dropped. "Blood." Adrian nodded grimly. "On the wind. It's close." Before she could ask what he meant, Adrian shifted partially into his wolf form, his nails elongating into claws and his teeth sharpening. His movements were fluid and practiced, as if he'd done this 100 times before. "Stay close," he growled, his voice deeper now, rougher. Tessa barely had time to react before a low snarl echoed through the alley. Her breath caught as a figure emerged from the shadows, a hollow one, its monstrous body hunched and its glowing eyes fixed on her. It was smaller than the ones she'd seen before, but there was something feral about it, its movements twitchy and erratic as though it had been tracking them for hours. Callan drew his blade instantly, the runes etched into the metal flaring to life. He stepped in front of Tessa, his green eyes blazing with focus. "Adrian." "I'll flank it," Adrian said, already moving with silent precision. The hollow one let out a guttural screech and lunged toward Tessa, its claws scraping against the pavement. Callan moved fast, intercepting it with a powerful swing of his blade. The strike cut deep into the creature's side, dark, viscous blood spilling onto the ground, but it didn't stop. It lashed out with its claws, forcing Callan to dodge back. Adrian struck next, leaping from the shadows with a savage growl. His claws raked across the hollow one's back, tearing through its smoky, insubstantial form. The creature howled in pain, but instead of retreating, it twisted around and snapped at Adrian, its jagged teeth just missing his throat. Tessa froze, the journal clutched to her chest as the fight unfolded in front of her. The creature was faster than she expected, its movements erratic and unpredictable, and the way it fought wild and unrelenting sent a chill through her. "Tessa." Callan's shout snapped her out of her daze. "Get behind something." She stumbled back, her heart racing as she pressed herself against the wall of the diner. Her hands shook as she clutched the journal tighter, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs refused to move. Another snarl tore through the air as the hollow one whipped around, its fiery eyes locking onto her. It charged, its claws outstretched and then stopped mid-lunge, its body contorting in pain as Adrian's claws tore through its side. The creature shrieked, its form flickering like a dying flame before dissolving into smoke. The alley fell silent, the only sound Adrian's heavy breathing as he straightened, his claws retracting. "That was too close," Callan muttered, wiping the dark blood off his blade. He turned to Tessa, his expression sharp. "Are you okay?" She nodded shakily, though her legs still felt like jelly. "Yeah, I wasn't expecting it to come after me like that. They always will," Adrian said, his voice cold. "You're the one they want, never forget that." Tessa swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. She glanced at the blackened mark on the pavement where the hollow one had fallen, her stomach twisting. "Was that the only one?" she asked. Adrian sniffed the air again, his amber eyes narrowing. For now, but there will be more. We need to keep moving, Callan said, glancing around the alley. If they're tracking us, it's only a matter of time before they send something worse. Tessa didn't ask what he meant by worse. She didn't want to know. They drove out of town, heading toward the outskirts where the fields gave way to dense forests. Adrian had insisted they find a new place to regroup, somewhere the Hollow Ones wouldn't immediately track them. Tessa stared out the window, her mind racing. The letter from her mother had given her some answers, but it had also left her with more questions than ever. What did her mom mean by using the box? And what was the power inside it? She glanced at Callan, who sat in the driver's seat with his usual focused expression. "Do you think it's possible?" she asked suddenly. He frowned. What, to use the box, to stop them? Callan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever's in that box, it's powerful enough to scare the Hollow Ones. That means it's dangerous. Using it might destroy them, but it might destroy everything else too." Tessa's chest tightened. The weight of the box on her lap felt heavier than ever, the strange energy pulsing faintly against her skin. It was alive in some way, responding to her emotions, her fear. Adrian, sitting in the passenger seat, glanced back at her. "Your mom left that letter for a reason," he said. "She believed you'd figure out how to handle this. Don't let doubt stop you." Tessa wanted to believe him, but the weight of responsibility pressing down on her was suffocating. The car slowed as they pulled into a clearing deep in the woods. The trees loomed high above them, their branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out most of the light. It was quiet here, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. "This will do," Adrian said, stepping out of the car. Tessa followed, clutching the box tightly as she looked around. The forest felt alive, every shadow and rustling leaf making her nerves buzz with tension. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian and Callan exchanged a glance. "Now," Callan said, his green eyes locking onto hers, "we figure out how to keep them from finding us again." "And what happens when they do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Callan's expression hardened. "Then we fight." Tessa swallowed hard, the box heavy in her hands, its faint hum a constant reminder of the power it held, and the danger it brought. Chapter 11, Bonds and Betrayals. The forest clearing felt like a fragile bubble of calm, but Tessa knew it wouldn't last. The Hollow Ones would come for her again, it was only a matter of time. And when they did, she had no idea if she, Callan, or Adrian would be ready. Callan knelt on the forest floor, his hands tracing a series of runes he'd etched into the dirt. The silvery stones from Adrian's safe house were scattered around the perimeter, forming a rough circle around the clearing. Every so often, Callan would glance at the box where it sat on a flat stone, its silver etchings faintly glowing in the fading light of day. Adrian, meanwhile, prowled the edges of the clearing in his partially shifted form, his amber eyes scanning the shadows. His ears twitched with every rustle of the leaves, his movements smooth and predatory. Tessa sat on a fallen log near the center, watching them work while clutching her mother's journal. The leather-bound book was heavy in her lap, but the answers inside it still felt out of reach. "How long will this hold them off?" she asked, breaking the silence. Callan glanced up from the rune he was finishing. "It's not meant to hold them off," he said. "It's meant to give us time to prepare." Her stomach twisted. "That's not exactly comforting." "It's the best we can do," Adrian said, his voice low and steady. He stopped near the edge of the clearing, sniffing the air. "You should rest while you can." Tessa laughed humorlessly, shaking her head. "Rest? I don't think I'm going to sleep again for the rest of my life." Callan stood, brushing dirt from his hands as he walked over to her. "You've been through a lot in the past 24 hours, he said, "but you're still here." "That counts for something." "Yeah, well, we'll see how long that lasts," she muttered, her fingers tightening on the journal. Callan crouched in front of her, his green eyes steady and calm. "You're stronger than you think, Tessa," he said softly. "Your mother believed in you. So does Adrian. And so do I. His words surprised her, and for a moment the weight on her chest felt a little lighter. But before she could respond, Adrian's low growl cut through the quiet. "We have company," he said. Tessa's heart lurched as Adrian turned toward the trees, his claws elongating. Callan stood immediately, his hand moving to the hilt of his blade. "What is it?" she asked, rising to her feet. Adrian sniffed the air again, his expression darkening. "Not hollow ones," he said, "but not friendly either." The tension in the clearing thickened as a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was a man, tall and lean, his dark hair streaked with gray and tied back at the nape of his neck. His sharp, angular features were striking, but there was something off about him, something cold and calculating in the way his dark eyes scanned the clearing. "Adrian," the man said, his voice smooth and confident. "It's been a long time." Adrian growled low in his throat, stepping in front of Tessa and Callan. "What are you doing here, Silas?" Silas smiled faintly, his gaze flicking to Tessa. "I could ask you the same thing, but I think I already know." Callan stepped forward, his blade partially drawn. "Stay back," he warned. Silas raised his hands in mock surrender. "Relax," he said. "I'm not here to fight." "Then why are you here?" Adrian demanded, his claws twitching at his sides. "To talk," Silas said, his tone calm but laced with something sinister. "I heard rumors about the box being found, and about the girl who's carrying it." Tessa's stomach twisted as Silas's dark eyes settled on her. "So," he said, his smile widening, "you're the one causing all the trouble." Tessa glared at him, her fear warring with anger. "If you're not here to fight, then what do you want?" Silas's smile didn't falter. "The same thing everyone wants, to survive." Adrian growled again. "You've never cared about survival unless it benefited you." "True," Silas admitted with a shrug. "But this time our goals align. The hollow ones are a threat to all of us, and I'm willing to help you if you're willing to trust me." "No," Adrian said immediately. Callan hesitated, his green eyes narrowing. "Why would you want to help us?" "Because I have no interest in watching this world burn," Silas said simply. "And because I know things you don't. Things that could tip the scales in your favor." Adrian stepped closer, his teeth bared. "We don't need your help, Silas." "Don't be so sure," Silas said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "You're dealing with forces far beyond your understanding, and if you think you can keep the girl alive without me, you're sorely mistaken." Tessa bristled at the way he said it, as if she were some helpless pawn in all of this. "I'm standing right here, you know," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Silas's smile widened. "Good, then you can decide for yourself. Do you want my help, or do you want to see how long you can last without it?" Tessa hesitated, glancing at Callan and Adrian. Adrian's expression was a mask of fury, but Callan looked more thoughtful, his gaze flicking between Silas and the box. "We can't trust him," Adrian growled. "But we might not have a choice," Callan said quietly. Tessa's chest tightened. She didn't like the idea of working with someone like Silas, someone who radiated danger and ulterior motives, but Callan was right. They needed all the help they could get. "What do you know?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay steady. Silas's dark eyes gleamed. "More than you realize," he said. "I know why the hollow ones are after the box. I know what's inside it, and I know what it will take to stop them." Tessa's heart pounded. "What's inside the box?" Silas smiled faintly, stepping closer. "A fragment of their world," he said. "Pure void energy, trapped and contained. It's the source of their power and their weakness." Her mind spun. "And what will it take to stop them?" Silas's smile faded, his expression turning serious. "Sacrifice," he said. "The kind you're not ready to make." Tessa's breath caught. Callan stepped in front of her, his blade gleaming. "That's enough," he said coldly. "If you're going to help, then help. But don't play games." Silas raised an eyebrow, then nodded. "Fair enough," he said. "But you'll see soon enough that I'm right." Adrian snarled, but he didn't protest as Silas stepped back into the shadows, his presence lingering like a cold wind. Tessa's grip on the journal tightened. She didn't know if they could trust him, but one thing was clear. The fight ahead would demand more than she'd ever thought possible. Chapter 12. The Mark Awakens night fell quickly over the forest, the fading light swallowed by shadows that seemed to stretch longer and darker than they should. The clearing was eerily silent, save for the crackle of the small fire Adrian had built. Tessa sat close to it, the box resting on the ground beside her, its faint glow pulsating like a heartbeat. She couldn't stop replaying Silas's words in her mind, a fragment of their world. Sacrifice. Each syllable felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. Callan sat a few feet away, sharpening his blade in slow, deliberate strokes, the rhythmic sound filling the quiet space. Adrian was further out, circling the perimeter of the clearing in his partially shifted form, his wolf-like eyes scanning the trees. They were on edge, all of them, waiting for the next attack. "You're quiet," Callan said, breaking the silence. Tessa glanced at him, her fingers absently tracing the edges of her mother's journal. "Just thinking. About Silas. About everything," she admitted. "The hollow ones, the box, my mom, it's like every time I think I've figured out how deep this goes, it gets worse." Callan paused, his green eyes meeting hers. "You're handling it better than most people would." She laughed softly, the sound brittle. "I don't feel like I'm handling it. I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water." Callan set his blade aside, leaning forward slightly. "That's what surviving feels like. You don't have to have all the answers, Tessa. You just have to keep going." She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the journal in her lap. "But what if I can't? What if this is too much for me?" "It's not," he said firmly. "Your mom believed in you. So do I." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for a moment the weight pressing on her chest eased. But the moment was short-lived. The box flared suddenly, its glow intensifying as a wave of energy rippled outward. Tessa gasped, instinctively reaching for it, but the moment her fingers brushed the surface, the world shifted. The fire seemed to dim, the trees blurring into shadowy forms. The air was heavy, electric, and Tessa's vision swam as she felt a sharp, pulling sensation deep inside her chest. "Tessa!" Callan's voice sounded distant, like he was speaking through water. She tried to respond, but her throat felt tight, her words trapped. Her hand stayed on the box, frozen in place as the silver patterns on its surface writhed and shifted, glowing brighter and brighter. And then she was somewhere else. She stood in a void, endless and dark, the ground beneath her feet smooth and cold. The air was silent, oppressive, and heavy with a strange energy that made her skin crawl. "Tessa," the voice echoed around her, low and hollow, sending a chill down her spine. She turned, but there was no one there, just the endless blackness stretching in every direction. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The air seemed to ripple, and a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall and human-like, but its form was indistinct, shifting like smoke caught in a breeze. Its eyes were empty voids, cold and consuming, and its presence sent a shiver of primal fear through her. "You carry what is ours," it said, its voice resonating in her bones. Tessa took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you mean?" "The fragment," the figure said. "The piece of our world stolen and hidden away. You are its bearer now." She felt the box in her hands, though she didn't remember picking it up. It pulsed faintly, its energy vibrating through her body. "Why are you after it?" she asked, her voice steadier now. "Because it is us," the figure said simply. "And because without it, your world will remain unbalanced." "Unbalanced," she repeated. "What does that mean?" The figure tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate. "It is not for you to understand," it said. "Return the fragment to us, and we will leave your world untouched." A chill ran through her. "And if I don't?" The figure's form seemed to expand, the darkness around it deepening. "Then we will take it by force, and we will not stop until your world is reduced to ash." Tessa's heart pounded as the weight of its words settled over her. She gripped the box tighter, the silver etchings glowing brighter in response. "Why me?" she demanded. "Why my family? Your bloodline was chosen long ago, the figure said. You are the tether, the link between our worlds. The fragment calls to you because it is bound to you. I didn't ask for this, she said, her voice rising. None do, the figure said, its tone colder now. But the choice is yours. Return it or suffer the consequences. The air grew heavier and the figure stepped closer, its void like eyes burning into her. Choose, bearer. Time is running out. Tessa clenched her fists, her body trembling. You don't scare me, she said, though her voice wavered. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it reached out, its smoky hand stretching toward her. The moment it touched her, a sharp, searing pain shot through her chest, and she screamed, Tessa. Her eyes snapped open, and she was back in the clearing. Callan was gripping her shoulders, his face pale and panicked. The fire burned low, and Adrian stood nearby, his claws out and his amber eyes scanning the trees. What happened? Callan demanded, shaking her slightly. Tessa blinked, her vision swimming. I saw them, she said, her voice hoarse. The hollow ones. Or something like them. What did they say? Adrian asked, his voice sharp. They want the box, she said, her hands trembling. They said it's part of them, that it's tied to me. They said if I don't give it back, they'll destroy everything. Callan's expression darkened. And if you do? She looked down at the box, its glow faint but steady now. I think it might be worse. The clearing fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Adrian stepped closer, his amber eyes hard. They're testing you, he said. Trying to break you. Don't let them. Tessa swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the box. The pain from the vision lingered, but so did something else, a faint, thrumming energy in her chest, as if a piece of the box's power had been left behind. I'm not giving it to them, she said firmly, her voice stronger now. No matter what they do. Callan's green eyes softened, and he gave her a small, approving nod. Good. But Adrian's gaze was colder, more calculating. Then you'd better be ready, he said. Because they'll come harder and faster now, and they'll do anything to break you. Tessa looked down at the box, its faint glow reflecting in her eyes. She didn't know if she could handle what was coming, but one thing was clear: she was going to have to fight. Chapter 13. The Hollow Ones. The forest felt different now, more alive, but not in the comforting way Tessa had known as a child. The trees whispered with every breeze, their branches clawing at the sky like they were trying to warn her. Even the earth beneath her feet seemed to hum faintly, as if it recognized the fragment she carried. The morning sun barely filtered through the canopy as Adrian led the way, his movements tense and deliberate. Callan stayed close to Tessa's side, his green eyes sharp and watchful. The box rested heavily in her arms, its glow muted but persistent. They're close, Adrian said suddenly, his voice low. Tessa froze, her pulse quickening. How can you tell? The air shifts when they are near, Adrian replied, his amber eyes narrowing. The world knows what they are even if most people don't. That's comforting, Tessa muttered, gripping the box tighter. Callan shot her a small, humorless smile. Stay focused. If they're tracking us, we'll know soon enough. The group moved in silence, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves setting Tessa's nerves on edge. Her vision blurred briefly, and she blinked hard, trying to shake the lingering effects of her encounter with the hollow one in the void. The mark they'd left on her, whatever it was, still thrummed faintly in her chest, a reminder that she was tied to them in ways she didn't fully understand. The path ahead sloped downward into a dense, fog-filled hollow. Adrian stopped at the edge, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. This is it, he said grimly. Tessa frowned. This is what? Their lair, Adrian said. Her stomach flipped. You mean they're here? They don't have one specific lair, Callan explained, his voice low. They create pockets of their world wherever they gather. This is one of them. Tessa hesitated, staring into the swirling mist. It seemed to move unnaturally, curling and shifting like something alive. What happens if we go in there? They'll know, Adrian said simply. She swallowed hard, the weight of the box pressing into her arms. And if we don't? They'll come out, Callan said, his tone steady but grim. And when they do, it'll be on their terms, not ours. Tessa looked at the two men, her fear warring with a growing sense of determination. So what's the plan? Adrian's claws flexed at his sides, his amber eyes gleaming. We go in, we see what they're hiding, and we get out alive. If we're lucky. Great, Tessa muttered, trying to steady her breathing. Love those odds. Callan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding. Stay close to me. No matter what you see in there, don't let go of the box. It's your anchor. Her anchor. The words stuck with her as they stepped into the mist. The air inside the hollow was colder, heavier, and thick with a metallic tang that burned in Tessa's throat. The fog swirled around them, muffling their footsteps and distorting the shapes of the trees. She clutched the box tightly, the silver etchings on its surface glowing faintly in response to the strange energy around them. This place isn't natural, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It's not supposed to be, Adrian said. It's a fragment of their world leaking into ours. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She glanced at Callan, who was scanning the area with a blade in one hand and a runestone in the other. See anything? She asked. Not yet, he said, his voice tense. They pressed on, the fog growing thicker with every step. Tessa's skin prickled, and a faint sound reached her ears, a low, droning hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. What is that? She asked, stopping in her tracks. Adrian turned, his expression grim. Them. Before she could respond, the fog shifted and a figure emerged from the haze. It was humanoid in shape but distorted, its body flickering and writhing like it couldn't fully maintain its form. Its eyes were dark voids, empty and endless, and its movements were jerky and unnatural. A hollow one. Callan stepped in front of Tessa, his blade raised. Stay behind me. The creature hissed, its voice low and guttural, and more shapes began to emerge from the fog. Tessa's heart pounded as the clearing filled with hollow ones, their numbers growing with each passing second. There's too many, she whispered, panic creeping into her voice. We hold them off, Adrian growled, his claws extending fully. Tessa, you stay back and keep that box safe. Don't let them touch it. Tessa nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched the box tighter. The first creature lunged, its claws swiping at Callan. He moved with practiced precision, his blade cutting through the hollow one's form with a flash of light. The creature shrieked, its body dissolving into smoke, but two more took its place. Adrian fought like a storm, his claws tearing through the creatures with savage efficiency. But for every hollow one they destroyed, more seemed to rise from the fog, their guttural growls filling the air. Tessa stumbled backward, her eyes darting between the chaos and the swirling mist. The box in her hands pulsed faintly, its glow growing brighter as the energy around her intensified. And then she felt it a pull, sharp and insistent, like the box was trying to guide her. Her breath hitched. What are you trying to tell me? She whispered, her voice shaking. The box pulsed again, and for a brief moment she saw something in the fog, a glimmer of light, faint but steady, cutting through the darkness. Tessa, get back. Callan shouted, his voice breaking through her trance. She turned just in time to see a hollow one lunging toward her, its claws outstretched. Without thinking, she raised the box, and the silver etchings flared with blinding light. The creature shrieked as the light consumed it, its form dissolving into nothingness. The glow faded quickly, leaving Tessa breathless and shaking. Adrian and Callan fought their way to her, their movements swift and brutal. What just happened? Callan demanded, his green eyes wide as he looked at the box. I don't know, Tessa said, her voice trembling. It did something. It protected me. Adrian glanced at the box, his expression dark. It's reacting to them, he said. To the void. The closer they get, the stronger it becomes. Then why don't we use it? Tessa asked desperately. If it can destroy them, we don't know what it'll do to you, Callan interrupted, his voice firm. The box is tied to you, Tessa. Using it might destroy them, but it could destroy you too. Her chest tightened as the weight of his words sank in. She looked at the box, its faint glow reflecting in her eyes. It was both a weapon and a danger, a power she didn't fully understand. But as the fog thickened and the hollow ones closed in, she realized something else. If she didn't use it, they were all going to die. "Get behind me," she said, her voice steadier now. Callan and Adrian exchanged a look, but they obeyed, forming a protective circle around her as the creatures surged forward. Tessa took a deep breath, her hands tightening on the box. The silver etchings flared again, and this time she didn't fight the pull. She let it in. The world seemed to tilt as a wave of energy burst from the box, rippling outward and slamming into the hollow ones. The creatures howled as the light consumed them, their forms dissolving into smoke and ash. The clearing fell silent, the fog dissipating into the trees. Tessa collapsed to her knees, the box still glowing faintly in her hands. Her chest heaved, her body trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. Callan knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" I think so," she said, though her voice wavered. Adrian stood nearby, his expression unreadable. "That was a warning," he said quietly. "Next time they'll send more." Tessa looked down at the box, its light flickering like a dying ember. She didn't know how much longer she could hold on to it or what it would cost her if she did. But one thing was certain: the hollow ones weren't going to stop. And neither could she. Chapter 14, Moonlit Allies. The forest had grown quiet again, the eerie stillness stretching long after the hollow ones had been vanquished. The box rested in Tessa's lap as she sat by the remains of the fire, her hands trembling from the lingering effects of the power she'd unleashed. Callan crouched nearby, sharpening his blade again, not because it needed it, but because it gave him something to do. Adrian stood at the edge of the clearing, his wolf-like form mostly receded, though his amber eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. Tessa glanced between them, her voice hesitant as she broke the silence. "You said they'll send more next time. What do we do when that happens?" Adrian turned, his gaze sharp and calculating. "We need reinforcements." "Reinforcements?" Tessa asked. "From where?" "I thought it was just us." "It doesn't have to be," Callan said, setting his blade aside. "There are others. People or things who can fight. But convincing them to help, that's the hard part." Adrian nodded, stepping closer. "There's a pack nearby," he said. "One that stayed out of the hollow one's path so far. But if they knew the truth, if they knew the danger, they might be willing to fight with us." "A pack," Tessa repeated. "You mean werewolves?" Adrian's expression didn't change. "Yes," Tessa blinked, still grappling with the existence of werewolves in general, let alone the idea of asking them for help. "Do you think they'll agree?" "They'll listen to me," Adrian said simply. "Because you're a wolf too?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded. "Something like that." Callan stood, his green eyes thoughtful. "If we're going to them, we need to move now. The hollow ones won't stay quiet for long, and if they find us before we've regrouped—" He didn't finish the thought, but Tessa didn't need him to. She glanced at the box, its glow dim but steady, and felt the weight of it pressing down on her again. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's go." The trek to the pack's territory was long and tense, the moon high overhead by the time they reached the edge of a sprawling valley. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air, and Tessa could feel the shift in energy as they crossed an invisible boundary. Adrian stopped, his posture straightening as he let out a low, guttural howl. The sound echoed through the trees, sending a shiver down Tessa's spine. "What was that?" she asked. "A signal," Adrian said. "They'll come to us." Tessa's stomach twisted as she glanced around the clearing. The shadows seemed to stretch and move, and she swore she heard faint rustling in the underbrush. Callan stayed close to her, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "They're watching us," he said quietly. "How can you tell?" "They always do," Adrian replied, his voice calm. Moments later, the first wolf appeared. It was massive, its sleek black fur blending into the darkness as it stepped forward. Its golden eyes glowed faintly, locking onto Adrian with a predatory intensity. More wolves followed, emerging from the shadows with silent grace. Tessa counted at least 6. their forms shifting and blending into the night like smoke. Adrian stepped forward, his body tense but confident. "Where's your alpha?" he called. The black wolf growled softly, and the air shimmered as its form shifted. In seconds, a man stood in its place, tall and broad-shouldered with sharp features and dark hair. His amber eyes burned with the same intensity as the wolf's, and he regarded Adrian with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Adrian," the man said, his voice deep. "It's been a long time." "Logan," Adrian replied, inclining his head slightly. Logan's gaze shifted to Tessa, his eyes narrowing. "You've brought outsiders into my territory. They're with me," Adrian said firmly, "and we need your help." Logan folded his arms, his expression skeptical. "Help with what?" Adrian glanced at Tessa, then back at Logan. "The Hollow Ones have returned. They're stronger than before, and they're after her." Logan's eyes flicked to the box in Tessa's hands, and his expression darkened. "That's not my problem," he said coldly. "It will be," Adrian said, his tone sharp. "The Hollow Ones don't stop. If they're not after her, they'll come for you. For your pack, for everyone." Logan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Callan stepped forward, his green eyes steady. "We're not asking you to fight for nothing," he said. "We have a weapon, something that can hurt them. But we need time to figure out how to use it. If you help us hold them off, we can stop this before it spreads." Logan studied him for a long moment, then shifted his gaze back to Adrian. "Why should I trust you?" Adrian's expression didn't waver. "Because you know I'm right. And because if we fail, there won't be anything left to protect." The silence that followed was heavy, the tension thick enough to cut. Tessa's heart pounded as Logan stepped closer, his amber eyes boring into hers. "What's your name?" he asked. "Tessa," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "And what makes you so important that the Hollow Ones want you?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I know they'll do anything to get this." She held up the box, its silver etchings glinting in the moonlight, "and I'm not going to let them." Logan's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, then he turned to Adrian. "If I agree to help, it's on my terms. My pack doesn't answer to anyone but me." "Understood," Adrian said. Logan nodded once. "We'll fight, but if this goes wrong, don't expect us to save you." Callan smirked faintly. "Noted." Logan turned to his pack, gesturing for them to follow him. "We'll meet you at the southern edge of the valley tomorrow night. Be ready." And with that, he shifted back into his wolf form, disappearing into the shadows with the rest of his pack. Tessa let out a shaky breath, her grip on the box tightening. "That went better than I expected." Adrian gave a small nod. "We have allies now, but it's not enough. The Hollow Ones won't stop coming, and the pack won't fight forever." Tessa looked at the box, its glow flickering faintly. She didn't know if it was enough to save them, but for the first time, she felt a spark of hope. "Then we'd better make it count," she said softly. And as the moonlight bathed the clearing, she silently vowed to do whatever it took to protect the people who were risking everything for her. Chapter 15. Beneath the surface, the southern edge of the valley was a place Tessa had never been, even in her years of exploring the woods as a child. It was a wild, untamed stretch of land where the trees grew so thick their branches twisted together, blotting out the sun even during the day. The air felt heavier here, the weight of something ancient pressing down on her chest as she followed Callan and Adrian deeper into the forest. The pack was waiting for them when they arrived. Logan stood at the head of the group, his broad frame tense and his amber eyes sharp as he surveyed the gathering. The rest of his pack lingered behind him in their wolf forms, their glowing eyes piercing through the shadows. "You're late," Logan said, his tone clipped. "We had to make sure we weren't followed," Adrian replied, his voice calm but firm. Logan's gaze flicked to Tessa, then to the box in her hands. "Is that it?" Tessa nodded, stepping closer. "It's tied to the Hollow Ones somehow. My family sealed it away, but now they're trying to get it back." Logan's expression darkened. "You're carrying something dangerous," he said bluntly. "I know," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "That's why I need your help." Logan studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Follow me." He led them deeper into the valley, the pack moving silently through the trees around them. Tessa stayed close to Callan, her grip on the box tightening as they descended into a narrow ravine. The air grew colder with every step, and the ground beneath their feet turned to damp, uneven stone. "Where are we going?" she asked. "There's something you need to see," Logan said without looking back. Tessa frowned but didn't press further. She could feel the energy around them shifting, a low, thrumming vibration that seemed to resonate with the box in her hands. Finally, they reached the mouth of a cave, its entrance hidden behind a curtain of thick, twisting vines. Logan pushed the vines aside, revealing a narrow tunnel that sloped downward into darkness. "Stay close," he said, stepping inside. The group followed, the air growing colder and more oppressive the deeper they went. Tessa's pulse quickened as the tunnel opened into a massive underground chamber, the walls lined with jagged black stone that seemed to glisten faintly in the dim light. At the center of the chamber was a stone altar, its surface etched with intricate runes that pulsed faintly in shades of silver and gold. The energy radiating from it was overwhelming, a powerful hum that vibrated through Tessa's bones. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "A fragment," Logan said, his tone grim. "This is what the Hollow Ones leave behind when they breach our world. It's a scar, a piece of their world bleeding into ours." Tessa stared at the altar, her chest tightening. The runes on its surface seemed familiar, echoing the patterns on the box in her hands. "Why did you bring us here?" Adrian asked, his voice tense. "Because this altar is connected to the box," Logan said. "Your family sealed it away, but the Hollow Ones have been trying to reopen the connection ever since. This is one of their anchors, one of the places they're using to pull their world into ours." Tessa's stomach twisted. "So what do? "We sever the connection," Logan said. "Destroy the altar, break the anchor. It won't stop the Hollow Ones entirely, but it'll weaken their hold on this area." Adrian frowned, his claws flexing at his sides. "Destroying something like this isn't easy. The magic binding it runs deep." Logan nodded. "That's why we'll need her." He looked at Tessa, his amber eyes narrowing. "The box holds the same energy as the altar. It's tied to it. If you can use the box's power, you might be able to destroy the anchor." Tessa's breath caught. "Use the box. It's dangerous," Callan said, stepping closer to her. "We don't know what it'll do to you. We don't have another option," Logan said firmly. "The longer this anchor stands, the stronger the Hollow Ones become. If we're going to stop them, we have to act now." Tessa looked down at the box, its silver etchings glowing faintly in her hands. She could feel the energy inside it, a pulsing power that both terrified and fascinated her. "What if I can't control it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We'll be here," Callan said, his green eyes steady. "You're not alone in this, Tessa. Whatever happens, we'll protect you." Her gaze flicked between him and the altar, her chest tightening with fear and uncertainty. But deep down, she knew he was right. There was no running from this. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, the box cradled tightly in her arms. The energy in the chamber seemed to shift, growing stronger as she approached the altar. The runes on its surface flared brightly, their glow matching the pulse of the box. "Place it on the altar," Logan said, his voice steady. Tessa hesitated, then carefully set the box on the stone. The moment it touched the surface, the entire chamber seemed to vibrate, the air crackling with energy. The runes on the altar twisted and writhed, their glow intensifying as the box's power surged outward. Tessa stumbled back, her hands trembling as the energy around her grew unbearable. "Tessa," Callan shouted, reaching for her. But before he could reach her, the box flared with blinding light and a wave of power exploded outward. The light consumed the chamber, and Tessa felt herself falling into the same void she'd seen before, the darkness cold and endless. She heard the voice again, hollow and resonant. "You cannot break what is already whole, bearer. You only delay the inevitable." She screamed, her voice swallowed by the void as the light around her intensified, and then it was over. She was on the ground, her chest heaving and her vision swimming. The altar was gone, reduced to jagged shards of stone, and the box lay on the ground, its glow faint but steady. "Tessa," Callan knelt beside her, his hands on her shoulders. "Are you okay?" She nodded weakly, her body trembling. I think so." Adrian stood nearby, his claws bloodied from fighting off the creatures that had emerged during the chaos. "The anchor's gone," he said, his voice grim. "But the fight's not over." Logan approached, his amber eyes dark. "You did it," he said. "You weakened them, but this is just the beginning." Tessa looked at the shattered remains of the altar, her chest tightening. The power of the box had saved them this time, but she could feel the cost. And she knew the hollow ones wouldn't stop until they claimed what was theirs. "We need to move," Adrian said, "before they regroup." Tessa nodded, gripping the box tightly as Callan helped her to her feet. The energy in the air was still heavy, but she felt a spark of hope burning deep inside her. The hollow ones were stronger than she'd imagined. But so was she. Chapter 16, The Blood Moon's Call night fell quickly as the group left the ruined altar behind, the shadows stretching long and dark beneath the dense canopy of trees. The forest felt heavier now, as if the destruction of the anchor had shifted something unseen. Tessa could feel it in the air, a pulsing energy that seemed to resonate with the box in her hands. Adrian led the way through the winding trails, his senses sharp and his claws partially extended. Callan walked beside Tessa, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his blade, while Logan and his pack flanked them, their wolf forms blending seamlessly into the night. "Do you feel that?" Tessa asked, her voice quiet but urgent. Callan glanced at her, his green eyes narrowing. "Feel what?" "The energy," she said, clutching the box tighter. "It's stronger now, like it's building." Logan slowed, turning his sharp amber gaze on her. "She's right," he said. "The hollow ones are reacting to what you did." Destroying the anchor didn't stop them, it only made them angrier. "Then why does it feel like the box is feeding off of it?" Tessa asked, her voice trembling. "It's like it's pulling the energy in, not pushing it away." Adrian's expression darkened as he stopped and turned to face her. "Because the box is tied to their world. It doesn't just repel the void, it absorbs it. That's why it's so dangerous." Tessa's breath caught. "If it absorbs their power, does that mean it's stronger now?" "Possibly," Callan said, his tone cautious. "But that also makes it more volatile. The more energy it takes in, the harder it'll be to control." Her chest tightened as she looked down at the box. Its glow was faint but steady, the silver etchings almost seeming to shift beneath her fingers. She thought of the altar, of the power she'd unleashed to destroy it. That power had been terrifying and exhilarating. "Let's keep moving," Logan growled, breaking the tense silence. "We're too exposed out here. The hollow ones will come for us soon." The group reached a rocky outcrop near the edge of the valley, just as the moon rose high into the sky. It was no ordinary moon, its pale light had taken on a faint, ominous red hue, bathing the forest in a blood-tinged glow. "The blood moon," Logan said grimly, his wolf form shifting as he stepped forward. "It's a bad omen." Tessa shivered, glancing up at the crimson orb. "What does it mean?" "It means the hollow ones are gathering their strength," Adrian said, his amber eyes gleaming in the dim light. "The blood moon amplifies their power. It's when they are at their most dangerous. And we're out here, waiting for them to show up," Tessa muttered. Callan gave her a small, wry smile. "We're not waiting. We're planning." Logan motioned for them to follow him to a narrow plateau overlooking the valley. From this vantage point, Tessa could see the dense forest stretching out below, the shadows deep and impenetrable beneath the eerie red glow of the moon. "The hollow ones will come from there," Logan said, pointing to a distant ridge where the trees seemed darker and denser. "They'll use the energy of the blood moon to push through in greater numbers." Adrian nodded. "We'll need to hold them here. If they break through, they'll overwhelm the town and everyone in it." Tessa's heart sank as she imagined the creatures pouring into Willow Creek, their claws and glowing eyes tearing through the quiet streets she'd grown up on. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Logan turned to his pack, his expression fierce. "We form a perimeter around the ridge. The wolves will slow them down, and Adrian, Callan, and I will take out as many as we can." "And me?" Tessa asked, gripping the box tightly. "You stay behind us," Callan said firmly. "The box is our last line of defense. If the hollow ones breach the perimeter, you'll need to use it to stop them." Tessa swallowed hard, her stomach twisting at the thought. "What if I can't control it?" "You can," Callan said, his voice steady. "You've already done it once. You just need to focus." She nodded, though doubt still gnawed at the edges of her resolve. The power of the box was unpredictable, wild, and it terrified her. As the night deepened, the wolves spread out along the ridge, their forms melting into the shadows. Tessa stayed close to Callan and Adrian, her heart pounding as they prepared for the inevitable attack. The first sign of the hollow ones came as a low, guttural hum that reverberated through the air, growing louder with every passing second. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. "They're coming," Adrian said, his claws extending fully. Tessa's grip on the box tightened as the first creature emerged from the shadows. It was larger than the others she'd seen, its hulking form writhing and shifting as though it couldn't fully maintain its shape. Its fiery eyes burned with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. More followed, their twisted forms spilling out of the forest like a dark tide. The wolves lunged forward, their snarls cutting through the night as they clashed with the hollow ones in a blur of claws and teeth. "Stay close to me," Callan said, his blade flashing as he stepped in front of Tessa. The battle was chaos. Adrian moved like a storm, his claws tearing through the creatures with savage precision. Logan's pack fought fiercely, their sharp teeth ripping into the hollow one's smoky forms, but the creatures kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. Tessa watched in horror as one of the wolves was struck down, its body crumpling to the ground before dissolving into ash. Another hollow one broke through the line, charging straight toward her. "Tessa, move," Callan shouted, stepping between her and the creature. His blade cut through its form, the runes glowing brightly, but it didn't stop. The box in Tessa's hands flared, its light blinding as a wave of energy burst outward. The creature shrieked, its body disintegrating into smoke and ash as the light consumed it. But the energy didn't stop. It surged outward, hitting the other hollow ones like a shock wave. The creatures faltered, their forms flickering, but Tessa felt the cost immediately. Her knees buckled and she collapsed to the ground, the box still glowing in her hands. "Tessa." Callan was at her side in an instant, his voice filled with worry. "I'm fine," she said weakly, though her vision swam and her chest felt heavy. "You're pushing yourself too hard," he said, his green eyes searching hers. "I didn't have a choice," she said, her voice trembling. They were going to break through. Adrian appeared beside them, his face grim. "The blood moon is fueling them," he said. "If we're going to hold them off, we need to end this fast." Tessa looked up at the moon, its crimson light burning brighter than ever. The energy from the box was still thrumming through her, a wild, untamed force that both terrified and exhilarated her. "We need to use the box," she said, her voice steadier now. Callan frowned. "Tessa, you saw what happened last time. If you push it too far, I'll be fine," she said, cutting him off. "But if we don't stop them now, we won't survive the night." Adrian nodded reluctantly. "Then do it. We'll cover you." Tessa took a deep breath, her hands tightening on the box. The energy inside it pulsed stronger, responding to her resolve. This was it. The hollow ones wanted the box, but she wasn't going to let them take it. Not without a fight. Chapter 17, Shadows and Sacrifice. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and blood, the guttural snarls of the hollow ones mixing with the growls of the wolves as the battle raged on. Tessa knelt in the center of the chaos, the box glowing faintly in her hands, its energy thrumming like a heartbeat. She felt the weight of every decision pressing down on her, but there was no time to hesitate. "Focus," Callan said, crouching beside her, his blade dripping with the dark, viscous blood of the hollow ones. His green eyes locked onto hers, steady and grounding. "You control the box, it doesn't control you." Tessa nodded, though her heart pounded so loudly it felt like it might burst. She closed her eyes, her fingers tracing the shifting silver etchings on the box's surface. The power inside it was wild, untamed, but it wasn't unfamiliar. It was the same energy she'd felt when she destroyed the altar, the same force that had protected her before. But it felt stronger now, more demanding. Adrian's voice cut through her thoughts. "They're regrouping," he shouted, his claws tearing through another hollow one as it lunged toward him. "Tessa, whatever you're going to do it now." Tessa opened her eyes, the glow of the box reflecting in her gaze. She stood, the weight of the artifact heavy in her hands. Around her, the hollow ones were closing in, their fiery eyes burning brighter beneath the crimson light of the blood moon. The wolves were fighting valiantly, but they were outnumbered. Logan's snarls echoed through the clearing as he ripped into one of the creatures, but even he looked like he was beginning to falter. "Tessa," Callan shouted, his blade slicing through the nearest hollow one. Now, taking a deep breath, Tessa stepped forward, the energy from the box surging through her veins like fire. She focused on the power, letting it rise, letting it flood her senses. It burned, fierce and unrelenting, but she didn't let it overwhelm her. Instead, she pushed it outward. The silver etchings on the box flared with blinding light, and a pulse of energy exploded from its surface, rippling outward in a massive wave. The hollow ones shrieked as the light struck them, their forms flickering and writhing before dissolving into ash. But the energy didn't stop. The pulse spread across the clearing, hitting everything in its path. The wolves yelped, retreating as the force washed over them, and even Adrian and Callan stumbled back, shielding their eyes from the brilliance. Tessa felt the power pulling at her, threatening to consume her entirely. Her vision blurred, and her knees buckled as the energy drained from her body. She fell to the ground, gasping for air as the box's glow dimmed to a faint flicker. "Tessa." Callan was at her side in an instant, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Are you okay?" She nodded weakly, though her body trembled. "I'm fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did it work?" Adrian stepped closer, his amber eyes scanning the clearing. The hollow ones were gone, their ash like remains scattered across the ground. The wolves regrouped, their forms shifting back into human shape as Logan approached, his expression grim but relieved. "You stopped them," Logan said, his voice low. "For now," Adrian added, his tone cautious. Tessa looked up at the blood moon, its crimson light still burning in the sky. The energy in the air had lessened, but it wasn't gone. She could still feel the presence of the hollow ones, distant but lingering, like shadows waiting to creep back in. "This isn't over," she said, her voice trembling. Logan nodded. "The blood moon will set soon. When it does, their power will weaken, but it won't disappear. They'll come back, stronger and more determined than ever." Callan helped Tessa to her feet, his grip steady and reassuring. "We can't keep doing this," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Every time you use the box, it takes more from you. If we don't figure out how to end this, it's going to destroy you." Tessa swallowed hard, the truth of his words sinking in. She could feel the strain in her body, the weight of the box's power pressing against her mind like a storm. "What do we do?" she asked, looking between them. Adrian's expression darkened. "We find the source," he said. "The hollow ones didn't come here on their own. Something drew them to this world, something that's keeping the connection between their world and ours alive." "The fragment," Logan said, nodding toward the box. "It's only a piece of the puzzle. If there's a way to sever the connection entirely, we need to find it." Tessa's chest tightened as she looked down at the box. The glow of its silver etchings was faint now, but the power inside it was still there, waiting. "And if we can't sever it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Adrian's amber eyes met hers, his gaze steady but grim. Then we'll have to destroy it. Her breath caught. Destroy the box. If it's the only way to stop the hollow ones, Callan said gently, then yes. Tessa looked at him, her heart pounding. The box was dangerous, unpredictable, but it was also her only weapon against the hollow ones. Without it, she didn't know how they'd survive. There has to be another way, she said, her voice shaking. Maybe there is, Logan said. But if there isn't, you need to be ready to make the call. The weight of his words pressed down on her, heavier than the box in her hands. She didn't know if she could do it, if she could destroy the one thing that had kept them alive this long. But as the blood moon cast its eerie light over the clearing, Tessa realized something else. If she didn't stop the hollow ones, there wouldn't be a world left to save. The group began their trek back through the forest, the wolves scouting ahead while Tessa stayed close to Callan and Adrian. The box felt heavier now, its energy quiet but insistent, a reminder of the power she'd unleashed and the price she'd paid. As they walked, Callan fell into step beside her. "Hey," he said softly, his green eyes searching hers. "You did good back there." She gave him a weak smile. "I feel like I'm barely holding it together." "Maybe," he said, his voice gentle. "But you're still here. That counts for something." Tessa nodded, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, she was alive, and that was enough. For now. Chapter 18, the final hunt. The night felt endless as Tessa followed Adrian and Callan through the forest, the wolves circling ahead like silent shadows. The air was sharp and cold, carrying with it the faint metallic tang that always seemed to signal the presence of the hollow ones. Despite the temporary reprieve after the fight beneath the blood moon, tension hung over the group like a storm cloud. They'd returned to the pack's main territory, a sprawling network of caves hidden deep in the mountains. Logan's pack moved quickly and efficiently, setting up watch posts and preparing for the inevitable return of the hollow ones. Tessa sat near the mouth of one of the larger caves, the box resting in her lap, its silver etchings faintly glowing. She stared down at it, her mind racing with questions she still didn't have answers to. What's inside you? Why are you tied to me? What happens if I can't stop them? Callan sat beside her, sharpening his blade in slow, methodical strokes. The sound was oddly calming, grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. "How are you holding up?" he asked, breaking the silence. Tessa shrugged, her fingers tightening on the edges of the box. "I don't know. I feel stretched thin. Like the more I use this thing, the more it takes from me. It is taking from you," he said quietly. "The box draws its power from you, Tessa. That's why it reacts so strongly when you're in danger. It's protecting itself as much as it's protecting you." She frowned, her stomach twisting. "And if I keep using it?" Callan hesitated, his green eyes darkening. Eventually, it could take too much. Tessa's chest tightened, but before she could respond, Adrian appeared, his expression grim. "They're moving," he said, his voice low. Tessa and Callan both stood, their attention snapping to him. "What do you mean?" Callan asked. Adrian glanced at the distant treetops, his amber eyes gleaming faintly in the moonlight. "Scouts picked up movement near the ridge we just left. The hollow ones are regrouping, and this time they're not just hunting us. They're heading straight for the town." Tessa's blood ran cold. "Willow Creek," Adrian nodded. "If they reach the town, it'll be a massacre." Logan approached, his expression as sharp and dangerous as ever. "Then we intercept them," he said. "We can't let them get that far. Do we know how many?" Callan asked. "Too many," Logan growled. "More than last time. They're pulling everything they have into this attack. It's an all-out push." Tessa's grip on the box tightened. "Because of me. Because of the box," Adrian corrected. "You're just the one carrying it." Her chest ached with the weight of his words. The hollow ones weren't just coming for her, they were coming for everything she'd ever known. "We'll split into 2 groups, Logan said, his tone all business. "Half the pack will hold the ridge to slow them down. The rest of us will push ahead and cut them off before they reach the valley. Adrian, you're with me." "Callan, I'm staying with her," Callan said firmly, stepping closer to Tessa. Logan didn't argue. "Fine, keep her safe. If the hollow ones break through, she's our last line of defense." Tessa swallowed hard, her pulse racing. "I don't know if I can do this again," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Callan placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip steady and reassuring. "You don't have to do it alone," he said. "We're with you. Always." The forest felt alive with tension as the group moved toward the ridge. Logan's pack shifted into their wolf forms, their movements silent and fluid as they melted into the shadows. Adrian walked ahead, his claws extended and his amber eyes scanning the darkness. Tessa stayed close to Callan, the box cradled tightly in her arms. She could feel its energy building again, responding to the growing threat. They reached the ridge just as the first wave of hollow ones appeared, their twisted forms emerging from the shadows like a tide of living nightmares. The wolves charged without hesitation, their snarls echoing through the trees as they clashed with the creatures in a violent, chaotic melee. Adrian leaped into the fray, his claws tearing through the hollow ones with brutal efficiency. Logan fought beside him, his massive wolf form a blur of teeth and fury. Tessa stood at the edge of the battle, her heart pounding as she watched the chaos unfold. She wanted to help, but the box's energy was already pressing against her, its pull stronger than ever. "They're trying to overwhelm us," Callan said, his blade slicing through one of the creatures as it lunged toward them. "They know this is their best chance to break through." "Then we can't let them," Tessa said, her voice trembling but determined. Callan gave her a sharp nod, his movements fluid and precise as he fought off another wave of hollow ones. But no matter how hard they fought, the creatures kept coming. Tessa felt the box's energy surge again, and she knew she couldn't hold back any longer. She stepped forward, the glow of the box intensifying as she focused on the power inside it. "Get back," she shouted to Callan. He hesitated, then obeyed, retreating just as the box flared with blinding light. The energy exploded outward in a massive wave, consuming the hollow ones in its path and scattering their ashen remains across the forest floor. But this time, the energy didn't fade. Instead, it kept building, the silver etchings on the box writhing and shifting like they were alive. Tessa gasped as the power flooded through her vision blurring and her knees buckling under the strain. "Tessa!" Callan was at her side in an instant, his arms steadying her. I can't stop it," she gasped, her voice trembling. Adrian and Logan reached them, their expressions grim. "What's happening?" Logan demanded. "The box is overloading," Adrian said, his voice tight. "It's taking in too much energy." "If we don't stop it," a deafening roar cut him off as a massive hollow one emerged from the shadows. It was unlike anything they'd seen before, twice the size of the others, its form rippling with pure void energy. Its eyes burned with a fiery intensity, and its claws tore through the earth as it charged toward them. "Protect her," Logan shouted, lunging at the creature with a savage growl. Adrian followed, his claws flashing as he tore into the hollow one's side. But the creature was too strong, its body reforming almost instantly as it swatted them aside like flies. Tessa stared at the monstrosity, her body trembling as the box's energy surged again. She knew what she had to do, but the thought of unleashing that much power terrified her. "Tessa," Callan said, his voice urgent, "you're the only one who can stop it." She looked at him, her heart breaking at the desperation in his eyes. "What if I can't?" she whispered. "You can," he said, his hand tightening on hers. "I believe in you." Tessa took a deep breath, her grip on the box tightening as she stepped forward. The hollow one roared, its fiery eyes locking onto her as it charged. And then she let the box's power take over. The light was blinding, the energy consuming everything in its path. Tessa felt it flood through her, burning and electric as the world around her disappeared in a sea of silver and gold. She heard the hollow one's roar, felt its presence dissolve into nothingness as the light swallowed it whole. and then there was silence. When the light faded, Tessa collapsed to the ground, her body trembling as the box fell from her hands. Callan was there instantly, pulling her into his arms as Adrian and Logan approached, their faces etched with relief and exhaustion. "It's over," Callan said softly, his voice steady despite the chaos that had just unfolded. Tessa nodded weakly, her eyes closing as the weight of the night finally caught up with her. But even as she drifted into unconsciousness, one thought lingered in her mind. It's not over yet. Chapter 19, Fractured Truths. Tessa woke to the sound of hushed voices and the faint scent of pine. Her body ached, every muscle screaming in protest as she blinked against the soft glow of firelight. She was in a cave, the jagged stone walls casting long shadows that flickered with each crackle of the fire. Tessa. Callan's voice was the first thing she registered, low and full of concern. She turned her head, finding him sitting beside her, his green eyes tired but alert. Relief washed over his face as she stirred. "You're awake," he said softly. "What happened?" Her voice was hoarse, her throat dry. "You stopped it," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "The big one, the hollow one. Whatever you did with the box, it worked. It's gone." Tessa's chest tightened as memories of the battle flooded back. The box's power had consumed her, the energy coursing through her like wildfire. She'd unleashed it, knowing it might destroy her, but somehow she'd survived. She pushed herself up slowly, her hands trembling. "And the others, Adrian, Logan, they're fine," Callan assured her. Logan's pack held the ridge, and Adrian's outside keeping watch. "The hollow ones retreated after you well after that." He gestured vaguely, his tone lighter, though she could hear the worry underneath. Tessa exhaled shakily, her gaze dropping to her lap. "The box, it's here," Callan said, nodding toward a spot near the fire. The box sat on a flat rock, its silver etchings dim now, almost dormant. "It's quiet for now. But whatever happened back there, it took a toll on you." She reached for the box instinctively, but Callan caught her wrist gently. "Don't," he said, his voice firm but kind. "Not yet. You need to rest." Tessa nodded reluctantly, letting her hand fall. The weight of the box seemed heavier than ever, even when it wasn't in her hands. Before she could respond, Adrian entered the cave, his amber eyes sharp and serious. Logan followed, his presence as commanding as ever despite the exhaustion etched into his face. "You're awake," Adrian said, his tone clipped. "Yeah," Tessa replied, her voice quiet. "Barely." Logan folded his arms, his gaze settling on her. "What you did back there, it shouldn't have been possible," he said bluntly. "The kind of power you unleashed, it's more than just the box. It's you." Tessa frowned, her stomach twisting. "What do you mean?" Adrian exchanged a glance with Logan before speaking. "The box is tied to your bloodline, Tessa. That much we've always known. But what we didn't realize is that it's not just a tool, it's a conduit. And it's not just drawing power from the void. It's drawing power from you." Her heart sank. "So it's using me." "Not exactly," Logan said. "It's more like you and the box are feeding off each other. The bond between you is stronger than we thought, and the more you use its power, the deeper that bond becomes." Tessa stared at them, her pulse quickening. "What happens if I keep using it?" Adrian's expression darkened. "You already know the answer to that." "It'll kill me," she said softly, the words heavy in the air. Logan nodded. "But it's worse than that. If the box drains you completely, it might not stop. It could turn its focus outward, pulling energy from the world around it, tearing the barrier between this world and the void apart." Tessa's chest tightened, her breath catching. She looked at Callan, who was watching her with a mixture of worry and determination. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How do we stop it?" Adrian stepped closer, his amber eyes locked on hers. "We find the source of the connection between the box and the void. The altar you destroyed was one anchor, but it wasn't the only one. There's something bigger, something that's keeping the void tethered to this world. And you think destroying it will sever the connection?" "It's our best shot," Adrian said. Logan spoke next, his tone grim. "But finding it won't be easy. The hollow ones will do everything they can to stop us, and if they get the box before we do, he didn't finish the sentence, but the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. Tessa swallowed hard, her hands clenching into fists. So where do we start? There's an old place, Adrian said, his voice lowering. A ruin buried deep in the mountains. It's older than Willow Creek, older than any of us. If there's a source, it's there. An ancient ruin, Tessa said, her voice tinged with disbelief. Of course. You're the one carrying the box, remember? Callan said, his attempt at humor doing little to ease the tension. Logan nodded. We leave at dawn. Get what rest you can. The hollow ones will know we're coming, and we won't get a second chance. Tessa lay awake that night, the faint crackle of the fire the only sound in the quiet cave. Callan had fallen asleep nearby, his blade resting within easy reach, while Adrian and Logan stood watch outside. She stared at the box, its silver etchings glinting faintly in the firelight. She could feel its presence even from across the room, a quiet hum at the edge of her thoughts. She thought of her mother's journal, of the warnings scrawled in its pages the seal will not hold forever. When it fails, the bearer must be ready. Her mother had known this moment would come. She'd known Tessa would be the one to face it, but she hadn't known the cost. Tessa reached for the journal, flipping through its pages in search of answers she wasn't sure she wanted to find. Her eyes landed on a passage near the back, written in her mother's hurried, looping script. The source of the connection lies where the veil is thinnest. To sever it, the bearer must give something in return, a life for a life, a bond for a bond. The box demands balance. It always has. Tessa's stomach turned as the meaning of the words sank in. The box didn't just demand power, it demanded sacrifice. Her sacrifice. She closed the journal, her hands trembling as she stared into the fire. The journey ahead was clear now, but the price of saving the world had never felt so real. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was ready to pay it. Chapter 20, the veil's edge, the rising sun cast pale, golden light over the jagged peaks of the mountains as the group set out. The journey was silent, each of them carrying the weight of what lay ahead. Tessa walked between Callan and Adrian, the box nestled securely in her arms. Its glow had grown faint again, but she could feel it humming softly, a subtle reminder of the power within. Logan led the way, his pack trailing behind in their wolf forms, their sharp eyes scanning the shadows. The air was cold and crisp, but Tessa barely noticed. Her thoughts were consumed by the journal's words, a life for a life, a bond for a bond. Are you sure about this place? Callan asked as they climbed a narrow, winding path along the side of the mountain. Adrian nodded. If there's a source, this is where it'll be. The ruins were built on the site of an ancient rift, one of the first places the void bled into our world. And no one thought to, I don't know, bury it under concrete or something. Tessa muttered, her voice tinged with nerves. Adrian glanced at her, his expression grim. The people who built the ruins tried to seal the rift, but their methods weren't permanent. They didn't have the box and they didn't have you. Her stomach twisted at the implication, but she didn't respond. By midday, they reached the entrance to the ruins, a massive stone archway carved into the mountainside. The air was heavy here, thick with a strange metallic tang that made Tessa's skin crawl. Faded runes were etched into the stone, their patterns eerily similar to those on the box. This is it, Logan said, his voice low. Tessa stared at the archway, her chest tightening. The energy radiating from the entrance was stronger than anything she'd felt before, pulsing in rhythm with the box in her hands. Stay sharp, Adrian warned. The hollow ones will know we're here. The group stepped inside, their footsteps echoing off the smooth, cold stone. The corridor sloped downward, the air growing colder with each step. Faint whispers seemed to echo through the darkness, but when Tessa glanced over her shoulder, there was nothing there. I hate this place, Callan muttered, his blade already drawn. You're not alone, Tessa said, gripping the box tighter. The corridor opened into a massive chamber, the ceiling towering high above them. Cracks in the stone walls glowed faintly with a silvery light, the same strange energy that pulsed from the box. At the center of the room stood a raised platform, and atop it was a jagged black obelisk that seemed to hum with power. "The rift," Adrian said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tessa stared at the obelisk, her pulse quickening. The energy pouring from it was overwhelming, pressing against her chest and making it hard to breathe. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We destroy it," Logan said, stepping forward, "but it won't be easy. The obelisk is tied to the void it'll fight back." Tessa's grip on the box tightened, and the box, what do I do with it? "You'll need to use it to sever the connection," Adrian said. "The box is tied to the void, but it's also tied to you. You're the only one who can control it." Her chest tightened as she looked at the obelisk. She could feel its pull, the way it called to the box, demanding to be whole again. Before anyone could say more, the shadows in the chamber shifted. The temperature dropped sharply, and a low, guttural hum filled the air. "They're here," Logan growled, his claws extending as his pack moved to the edges of the room. The hollow ones emerged from the darkness, their forms twisting and flickering as they surrounded the group. These were stronger than the ones Tessa had faced before, their fiery eyes burning with an intensity that made her blood run cold. "They're trying to protect the rift," Callan said, his blade already slicing through the first creature that lunged at them. Logan's pack charged into the fray, their snarls echoing through the chamber as they clashed with the hollow ones. Adrian fought with brutal efficiency, his claws tearing through the creature's smoky forms, but more kept coming, pouring into the chamber like a relentless tide. "Tessa, now," Adrian shouted. "Get to the obelisk." She hesitated for only a moment before running toward the platform, Callan close on her heels. The box grew heavier in her hands, its glow intensifying as she approached the rift. The obelisk pulsed with energy, its surface writhing with black and silver patterns. Tessa stepped onto the platform, her breath catching as the box flared in response. "Place it on the rift." Callan shouted, fending off a hollow one that lunged toward her. She obeyed, setting the box on the base of the obelisk. The moment it touched the stone, the room erupted with light, the energy from the box and the rift colliding in a violent, blinding surge. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and Tessa cried out as the power surged through her, pulling her into the same void she'd seen before. The darkness was cold and endless, the same as it had been the first time she'd felt its pull. But this time, it was stronger, more insistent. "Tessa," the voice echoed around her, low and hollow. She turned, her breath hitching as the same figure emerged from the shadows. "You cannot stop this," it said, its void like eyes burning into hers. "The connection is eternal. The box is eternal. You are nothing more than a vessel." "I'm more than that," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. The figure tilted its head, its smoky form twisting. "Are you willing to give everything to prove it?" The words hit her like a blow, the weight of her mother's journal pressing against her thoughts. A life for a life. A bond for a bond. The box flared in her hands, its energy coursing through her like fire. Tessa gritted her teeth, tears streaming down her face as she forced herself to focus. "This ends here," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her heart. The figure lunged toward her, but she didn't flinch. She unleashed the box's power, the light consuming everything as the void screamed around her. When Tessa opened her eyes, she was back in the chamber. The obelisk was gone, reduced to shards of black stone, and the hollow ones had disappeared, their presence wiped from the room. She collapsed to her knees, her body trembling as Callan caught her, steadying her in his arms. "You did it," he said softly, his voice full of relief. The box sat on the ground, its glow faint and flickering. Tessa stared at it, her breath shallow as the enormity of what she'd done settled over her. "It's over," Adrian said, stepping forward, but his tone held caution. Logan nodded, his expression grim. For now, Tessa knew he was right. The rift was gone, but the box was still here, its power lingering. The connection wasn't fully severed, it never would be, but for the first time she felt hope. She'd survived, and as long as she was alive, she'd keep fighting.